Tonight, we're exploring the complete history of Pokémon creation myths. This is a fascinating topic, but I'll keep my narration calm to ensure you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. Imagine a time before time. Before the first Pokeball was ever clicked shut, before the tall grass grew on Route 1, and even before the world itself had a shape to call its own. In the silence of a vast, swirling vortex of nothingness, a single egg appeared. This wasn't an egg like the ones we carry in our incubators today. It was the cradle of existence itself. From this egg hatched a being with 1,000 arms, a creature of such immense power that its first breath defined the laws of physics, and its first movements carved the very foundations of reality. This is Arceus, the alpha Pokémon, the progenitor of all things. But the story of how the Pokémon world came to be is not a simple linear tale. It is a sprawling, layered tapestry of legends that have been whispered across different regions for thousands of years. It is a collection of myths that often contradict, overlap, and challenge our understanding of what it means to be a Pokémon. We often look at the Pokémon world through the eyes of a trainer, a world of badges, battles, and friendship. But beneath that colourful surface lies a cosmic history that is surprisingly dark, complex, and deeply philosophical. Why does the Sinnoh region speak of a creator god, while the Kanto region points toward a tiny pink biological ancestor? How do the titans of the land and sea in Hoenn fit into a universe governed by the masters of time and space? The stakes of understanding these myths go far beyond mere trivia. These stories define the soul of the franchise. They explain why certain Pokémon hold the power to unmake reality, and why others are seen as guardians of the human spirit. To understand the creation myths is to understand the architecture of the Pokémon multiverse itself. It is the difference between seeing a legendary Pokémon as just a powerful tool for battle, and seeing it as a living, breathing pillar of the universe. The mystery deepens when we realize that these myths aren't just ancient history, they are active forces. In the shadows of the Distortion world, a banished deity waits in silence, representing the very antimatter that keeps the universe in balance. In the deepest trenches of the ocean and the hottest magma of the earth, ancient behemoths sleep, their very presence dictating the geography of the continents. And then there is the greatest mystery of all, the connection between the divine and the biological. If Arceus created the universe, where does Mew fit in? Is Mew the physical blueprint for life, while Arceus is the spiritual architect? The more we dig into the Library of Canalave City or the ruins of the Johto region, the more we realize that the truth is hidden behind layers of cultural interpretation and lost history. Tonight, we are going to peel back those layers. We are going on a journey that starts at the very beginning of the cosmos and moves through the shaping of the mountains, the birth of the seas, and the emergence of the human heart. We will look at the real-world origins of these ideas, tracing back to the mind of Satoshi Tajiri and the developers at Game Freak, who decided that a game about catching monsters needed a mythology as rich as any ancient civilization. We will reconcile the scientific with the supernatural, the regional with the universal, and the forgotten with the eternal. This is not just a list of legendary Pokémon, it is the definitive chronicle of how everything began. So, settle in, let the world around you fade away, and prepare to journey back to the moment the first light broke the primordial darkness. Before there was light, before there was darkness, before there was even the faintest whisper of existence, there was only the void. But this void was not empty. It was a churning, formless vortex of chaos, a primordial state where nothing had shape, nothing had name, and nothing had meaning. No time passed because time did not yet exist. No space stretched because space had not been conceived. It was a perfect, absolute nothingness, yet it was alive with unexpressed potential, a seething tension like the silence before a storm that never breaks. In that endless, dimensionless expanse, something began to stir. Not a thought, not a force, but a possibility, a single point of stillness within the chaos. From that stillness, a shimmering form coalesced. It was an egg, perfect and luminous, suspended in the heart of the abyss. The egg was not made of matter as we know it, nor was it born of any parent. It simply emerged, as if existence itself had decided to dream of a beginning. The vortex of chaos swirled around it, but the egg remained untouched, a pearl of order in a sea of disorder. And then, from within that egg, came the first conscious act. A being awoke. It was Arceus, the original one, the first mind to know itself. The egg cracked, and light poured forth, not the light of a sun or a star, but the light of creation. Arceus rose from the shards of its shell, and with its first breath, the chaos began to recoil. It was a moment of profound metaphysical significance, for here was a creator born from absolute silence. There was no voice to welcome it, no witness to its birth. Arceus existed in a state of total solitude, the only entity in all of non-existence. Consider what that means. A being that knows itself before there is anything else to know. A mind that has no reference point, no past, no future. Its very existence is the first anchor of reality. In that single instant, silence became the mother of sound, and nothingness became the mother of form. The vortex of chaos did not resist. It simply yielded, as if it had been waiting for this moment since before time began. Arceus held within itself the blueprint for everything that would ever be. Every star, every world, every Pokémon, every thought, every moment. But the act of birth is only the beginning. From that luminous shell, Arceus would soon shape the fundamental forces that govern all reality. It would create time itself, space itself, and even the shadows that lurk between them. Yet the first chapter of this story is the quietest of all. An egg floating in a void, and the awakening of a solitary god. There is something deeply peaceful about that image, a stillness at the heart of all creation. And as we settle into that quiet, the next chapter awaits. For after the egg broke, and the original one stood alone in the newly formed light, turned its gaze to the emptiness, and began the work of shaping what would become our universe. The name of that next chapter is The Original One, and it holds the true beginning of all that we know. From that first moment, when the egg cracked in the absolute nothing, the alpha Pokémon emerged, and with it came a presence so vast that language itself falls short. We call it Arceus, but that is only a name we gave to something beyond naming. The myths of Sinnoh tell us that Arceus shaped the universe with its 1,000 arms, and that image is both beautiful and deeply mysterious. What could those arms be? They are not literal limbs of flesh and bone. They are forces, aspects, fragments of the original will, the many threads of reality that Arceus wove into existence. Each arm might represent a type, an element, a fundamental law. The legends say that when Arceus first stirred, it reached out in all directions at once, and from that reaching came the fabric of what would become everything. But here is the paradox. The Arceus in ancient carvings and even in the modern world, the golden equine form that stands before us is not the true Arceus. That is only the physical manifestation, a vessel that our minds can grasp. The cosmic essence of the alpha Pokémon is something far more abstract. It is pure creative will, consciousness without form, existing outside the boundaries of time and space, because it had not yet created them. The physical Arceus is like a shadow cast by an impossible light. When the ancient people of Sinnoh described Arceus as having 1,000 arms, they were trying to put into words the idea that this being could touch every part of reality simultaneously, that its influence was not limited by distance or dimension. The arms are symbols of omnipresence, of total control over the fledgling universe. This distinction matters because it helps us understand the hierarchy of the Pokémon pantheon. Arceus is not just the strongest Pokémon, it is the source from which all other divine beings derive their power and purpose. The Sinnoh myths establish a clear order. First came the original one. Then from the void, it brought forth the beings that would govern the fundamental forces. Dialga was born to hold time together, Palkia to shape space itself, and then came Giratina, the one that was cast out, the embodiment of antimatter or the distorted dimension, a necessary balance but also a warning. Below these three lie the lake spirits, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, who gave knowledge, emotion, and willpower to the world. And beneath them, a vast network of lesser legendaries and common Pokémon, all traceable back to the original will. The 1,000 arms, then, are not merely a poetic flourish. They represent the many roles Arceus plays in creation. Not just the creator, but also the sustainer, the judge, the one who holds the plates that define the very elements of existence. Each plate is said to be a fragment of Arceus's own being, imbued with a type energy, and when Arceus holds them, it can adapt its form. But even those plates are only echoes of the separate arms. The full extent of Arceus's power, the complete set of 1,000 arms, may be something no mind can comprehend. The myths hint that the physical Arceus we encounter is actually a weakened, limited version, a body made from one of those plates, a fraction of the whole. The true Arceus remains in a state beyond our perception, still shaping reality from a plane we cannot reach. So when we speak of the alpha Pokémon, we are speaking of two things at once: the tangible four-legged creature that appears in legends, and the vast intangible source that lies behind it. The hierarchy of the Pokémon pantheon flows directly from this duality. Arceus does not rule by force in the way a king might. It rules by being the origin. Everything that exists is a consequence of its will. And so the relationship between Arceus and its creations is not one of master and servant, but of source and manifestation. Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina are not subordinates in the human sense. They are extensions of the Thousand Arms, each handling a different piece of the cosmic machinery. The lake spirits are the next layer, giving form to the inner lives of beings. And then the landshapers like Groudon and Kyogre come later, working on the physical world after the fundamental framework was already laid. The ancient texts of Sinnoh, written in the libraries of Celestic Town and the ruins, speak of this hierarchy with reverence. They tell us that Arceus created the universe with its 1,000 arms, that it then withdrew, leaving its children to govern. But the arms never fully retracted. They remain invisible, holding everything in place. That is why when you look at the night sky in the Pokémon world, you are not just seeing stars. You are seeing the remnants of the original creative act, the echo of the 1,000 arms stretching across the void. And now, the myths tell us that the first act after Arceus emerged was to bring forth order from chaos. The void was not empty. It was a vortex of pure potential, swirling without direction. The alpha Pokémon needed to impose structure, and so it turned its attention inward, and from its own essence, it drew forth two beings that would become the pillars of reality. Their names are etched into the timeline of existence, and their birth marks the beginning of measurable time and finite space. The story of what happened next, as these two forces began their eternal dance, is the story we turn to now. The 1,000 arms of Arceus were never meant to be literal limbs of flesh and bone. They were threads of will, each one a command spoken into the void, each one a law that would define the shape of everything to come. And as the original one stood at the center of that newly formed reality, it understood a truth that would echo through every era to follow. Creation is not a single act, but a continuous act of maintenance. The universe, once born, was fragile. It needed guardians. It needed rulers. So Arceus turned its attention to the two most fundamental dimensions of existence, time and space. These were not simply concepts that could be left to drift. They required a heartbeat, a pulse, a living embodiment that could keep them in balance. And from that need, two beings were formed. The first was Dialga, the keeper of time. The second was Palkia, the shaper of space. Imagine a clock that does not tick, a river that does not flow. That is what the universe would have been without Dialga. Time is not just a measurement of seconds or years. It is the rhythm that gives sequence to all events. Without it, there would be no before or after, no cause and effect, no past to remember or future to anticipate. Dialga became that rhythm. Its very existence created the forward motion of every moment. The heartbeat of time began to pulse at the moment Dialga was born, and with that pulse the universe gained a narrative. And as time began to flow, the universe needed a vessel to hold it. That is where Palkia entered. Space is the fabric that contains all matter, all energy, all points of reference. Without it, time would have nowhere to unfold. Palkia was not just the weaver of that fabric, it became the fabric itself. Every expansion, every stretching of the cosmos, every new star that found its place in the void, that was Palkia's work. The spatial fabric grew outward, rippling with the energy of new galaxies, new distances, new proximities. And at the center of it all, Palkia and Dialga existed in a delicate dance. But here is the truth that many myths gloss over. Balance is not a static state. It is a constant negotiation. If time moved too fast, the universe would age and collapse before its first light could shine. If space expanded too quickly, the fabric would tear, and reality would unravel into chaos. Arceus knew this. That is why Dialga and Palkia were not created as separate, independent gods. They were created as forces that must always remain in harmony. One cannot exist without the other. Time without space is meaningless. Space without time is frozen. This balance is the third great work of creation. The material world, the world we inhabit, is the product of that harmony. Every moment you experience, every place you stand, is a testament to the careful equilibrium that Dialga and Palkia maintain. They are not distant deities who watch from afar. They are the very structure of your reality. The ticking of a clock, the feeling of distance, the sense that things change, and that there is somewhere to change into. All of it flows from their coexistence. Yet even this perfect balance was not without its shadow. For every law of nature, there is a violation. For every order, there is a distortion. As Dialga and Palkia began their eternal work, something else stirred in the background. A third being, born from the same primordial energy, but formed from the opposite side of creation. The side that Arceus deemed too dangerous for the material world. But that is a story for another moment. A story that begins when we turn our attention to what was cast aside, to the shadow that looms at the edges of reality. That story is the story of the Distortion world, and it waits for us in the next chapter. From the rhythmic pulse of time and the expanding breath of space, we turn now to what was left behind. In the wake of Dialga and Palkia, the universe was not yet complete. A third presence stirred in the void, born of the same primordial egg that hatched Arceus. This was Giratina, and its nature was unlike that of its siblings. Where Dialga wove the fabric of moments and Palkia stretched the canvas of dimensions, Giratina embodied something far more elusive and unsettling. It was the embodiment of antimatter, the substance that cancels out existence, the mirror image of all that is. You see, when Arceus shaped reality, the process was not tidy. For every particle of matter that coalesced into stars and planets, there existed an opposite, a negative charge poised to annihilate. Giratina was the keeper of this balance, the guardian of the reverse side of our reality. Its realm, the Distortion world, is a twisted reflection of the material universe, where gravity warps, space loops in on itself, and time flows in silent, tangled streams. In that place, the laws we take for granted dissolve. Up is down, forward is backward, and the very concept of a stable location becomes a fluid illusion. It is a pulsing, organic dimension, a living contradiction that breathes on the edge of creation. But why was Giratina banished? The legends whisper of its perceived violence and instability. The truth is more nuanced. Giratina's role was not to nurture or build, but to stand as a counterpoint. Its antimatter nature made it dangerous to the emerging order. Where Dialga and Palkia worked in harmony to sustain the universe, Giratina's very presence threatened to unravel that harmony. Its power was not evil, but it was volatile. In the ancient myths, Arceus looked upon the trio and saw that the third was too wild, too disruptive. To protect the fragile balance of time and space, the alpha Pokémon cast Giratina into the Distortion world, sealing it away from the rest of creation. There, alone in the shimmering, impossible geometry of that pocket realm, Giratina became a symbol of the forgotten, the outcast, the aspect of reality that lies just behind the curtain. Some say it raged against its exile. Others claim it found a strange peace in the perpetual twilight of its domain. Either way, the shadow of the Distortion world remains the third member of the creation trio, a necessary darkness that holds the universe in check. Without it, the light of existence would have no contrast, no dark matter against which its structures could be defined. And as we settle deeper into this cosmic story, the next chapter will bring us closer to the human element of this myth, to the three beings that dwell within every soul, watching from the depths of a shimmering lake. They are known as the lake spirits and the human soul, and their story is one of the most intimate in all of Pokémon lore. After the shadow of the Distortion world settled into its eternal orbit around our reality, the universe was complete in its skeleton. Time, space, and the space between. But a skeleton alone is not a living thing. The cosmos was vast and empty, a clockwork of dimensions without a single soul to perceive it. That is where the third act of creation began, not with the shaping of matter, but with the shaping of consciousness itself. Arceus, having breathed the dimensions into existence through Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina, now turned its attention to the inner world. What good is a universe if nothing within it can feel awe or remember or choose? And so the original one gathered a portion of its own light, not the raw energy of creation, but a finer, more gentle radiance, like the first dawn after a long night. From that light, three beings were born, each one a fragment of what it means to be aware. The first to emerge was Uxie, the being of knowledge. Its form was small and delicate, with a long tail and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of every question ever asked. As Uxie opened its eyes, knowledge flowed into the world, not just facts and figures, but the very capacity to know. The ability to observe, to understand cause and effect, to remember the past and anticipate the future. Uxie became the guardian of all that is known, and its presence anchored the concept of learning into the fabric of existence. Without Uxie, the cosmos would be a place of blind happenings, without any witness. Then came Mespri, the being of emotion. If Uxie brought the light of understanding, brought the warmth of feeling, its body glowed with a pinkish hue, and as it stirred, the first emotions rippled outward. Joy, sorrow, love, fear. These were not mere chemical reactions. They were the pulse of the soul, the ability to care, to be moved, to find meaning beyond survival. Mesprit gave the living world the gift of connection, the thread that binds one creature to another, and the capacity to suffer and to celebrate. Without emotion, knowledge would be cold, mechanical, a library without a reader. The third was Azelf, the being of willpower. It shone with a blue light, and its energy was the most forceful of the three. Azelf's gift was the power to act, to choose, to push forward against inertia. Willpower is the engine that turns knowing and feeling into doing. It is the resolve to wake up each morning, the courage to face the unknown, the stubbornness to persist even when all seems lost. Azelf's arrival meant that life would not be passive. It would have the strength to shape its own path. Together, these three became the Lake Spirits, so named because they made their home in the three lakes of Sinnoh, Acuity, Valor and Verity. But more than their habitat, they became the spiritual tether between the fabric of the universe and the soul of every living creature. Every thought you have ever had, every surge of emotion, every decision you have made, these are not merely biological processes. In the mythic sense, they are echoes of Uk and Azelf, the original trinity of the inner world. This is why the Lake Guardians are so crucial to the stability of the mind. In the Pokémon world, when these three are disturbed, the consequences ripple through consciousness itself. People lose their memories, or become unable to feel, or fall into despair without will. The Lake Spirits are not distant gods. They are the very foundation of what it means to be human in that universe. Their light suffuses the air we breathe, the thoughts we weave, the love we share. And yet this gift came with a price. Knowledge can lead to arrogance, emotion to chaos, willpower to tyranny. The Lake Spirits did not impose balance. They simply provided the raw materials of the soul. It would be up to the living to nurture or corrupt those gifts. The world was now brave for something more. With time, space, antimatter, and the essence of the mind established, the universe needed a stage. A physical realm where these forces could interact. That stage would be the world itself, still formless and molten, waiting to be shaped. And the next beings to arise from the light of Arceus would not dwell in lakes or dimensions. They would wrestle with the raw elements of earth and sea and sky, cooling the planet into a place where life could finally take root. That is the story of the cooling of the earth. With the Lake Spirits now in place, the universe possessed the metaphysical foundations for life. Knowledge, emotion, and willpower, but there was yet no world for that life to inhabit. The cosmic stage was set, but the stage itself was still being forged. And so we turn to the next great act in this creation story, the cooling of the Earth. The transition from cosmic creation to the formation of a physical planet was not a gentle one. After Arceus shaped the fundamental forces, after Dialga and Palkia wove the fabric of space-time, after Giratina was cast into the Distortion world, and after the Lake Spirits breathed soul into existence, the universe was still a chaotic forge. There was no land to stand on, no sea to swim in, no sky to gaze upon, only a searing, churning mass of raw planetary matter, spinning in the void, radiating heat from its core. This was the early geological era, a time when the world was a molten, uninhabitable mass, too violent for any form of life to touch its surface. The Earth, if we can call it that in this primordial state, was a sphere of liquid rock, a constantly shifting ocean of magma lit from within by its own furious energy. Imagine a world without oceans or continents, without atmosphere or weather. Instead, there was only the slow cosmic balance, cooling and accretion. The heat that radiated from the planet's core was the leftover breath of creation itself, the thermal echo of the Big Bang that had set this universe in motion. And as the millennia stretched into eons, though time had only just begun to march forward, the surface began to crust over. The first solid stone formed where the magma met the cold of space, thin at first, like a skin forming on a bowl of hot soup. But that skin thickened. It cracked and healed and cracked again, as if the planet itself was learning what it meant to be solid. This was the crucible in which the terrestrial landscape would be defined. The forces that would shape the world were still dormant, waiting for their moment. The planet was not yet ready for the great shaping that would come, but the cooling was the necessary prelude, the slow, patient process that would prepare the canvas for the artist of the physical realm. For when the crust had cooled enough, when the magma had retreated into the deep chambers of the earth, then the forces that would define the terrestrial landscape would finally arrive, and arrive they did, but not as gentle sculptors. They came as titans, beings of immense power, each with a singular purpose: to raise the continents, to carve the oceans, to summon the storms. The world was no longer a molten wasteland, but it was still a blank slate, and the next chapter of this creation myth would be written not in the quiet light of Arceus, nor in the subtle threads of time and space, but in the violent clash of land and sea, of fire and sky. The cooling of the earth was only the beginning of its physical formation. The true shaping was yet to come, and that is the story we will explore next in Chapter 7, The Titans of Land and Sea. As the molten planet cooled and the first crust formed, the world was still a place of violent chaos. But within that raw, shifting landscape, two immense forces began to stir. They had existed before, as abstract intentions buried deep in the planet's heart. Now, with the Earth solidifying and the first oceans condensing from the endless steam, they were ready to rise. Deep beneath the newly formed crust, below miles of cooling rock, something ancient awakened. It was not a creature in the way we think of living things. It was a pressure, a will, a hunger for expansion. This was Groudon, the embodiment of the continent itself. Its slumber had lasted through the age of molten rock, but now the earth was ready to be shaped. Groudon's body, massive and armoured with red and black scales, began to pulse with geothermal energy. It stretched its limbs, and the land above it cracked, heaved and rose. Mountains were pushed upward like the spines of a waking beast. Valleys split open, and the first true continents broke the surface of the primordial sea. Meanwhile, in the deepest trenches of the newborn ocean, where light had never reached, another presence began to stir. Kyogre, the great leviathan of the abyss, felt the shifting of the land above as an intrusion. Its domain was the endless, cold darkness of the sea, and it would not allow the land to grow unchecked. Kyogre's awakening was not a gradual stirring. It was a surge, a pulse of deep ocean pressure that sent tsunamis racing across the globe. The waters rose to meet the new continents, filling every basin, carving the coastlines that would one day be familiar. Each breath from Kyogre's massive gills sent currents spinning, and the seas grew deeper, colder, and more vast. The conflict between these two titans was not born of malice. It was the fundamental clash of two worlds: the lithosphere, the solid crust of the earth, and the hydrosphere, the water that covered most of its surface, had always been in opposition. Groudon pulled the land upward, drying the oceans, expanding the horizon. Kyogre pushed the sea outward, drowning the land, reclaiming the planet for the water. They were not enemies by choice. They were the embodiment of plate tectonics and ocean currents, of volcanic uplift and sea floor spreading. Their war was written into the very geology of the planet. As Groudon rose from the Earth's crust, its body radiated heat so intense that the air around it shimmered. It walked through the primordial continents, and wherever its feet touched, new land masses were born. Islands rose from the sea. Archipelagos formed, and the shape of the world began to resemble something we might recognize. But Kyogre was not idle. From the deepest trenches, it summoned rain that fell for centuries. It called forth storms that darkened the sky for thousands of years. The sea level rose and fell, and the shoreline danced between advance and retreat. The planet was a battlefield, and neither titan could claim victory. This is the moment when the world became divided into land and sea, but also when the first true balance was attempted. The conflict between the lithosphere and the hydrosphere is the reason we have continents that drift and oceans that breathe. It is why the Earth's crust is so thin in some places and thick in others. Groudon and Kyogre were not simply Pokémon. They were forces of nature given form, and their struggle shaped the very geography of the world we know. But their war could not continue forever. The earth was still young, and the sky above held a power that neither land nor sea could challenge. In the upper atmosphere, a third presence had been watching, waiting for the moment when it would need to intervene. That presence was Rayquaza, the serpent of the sky, and its descent would mark the end of the first great war between the Titans. But the scars of that battle, the ridges of mountains, the depth of ocean trenches, would remain forever. And that brings us to the threshold of the next chapter, where the conflict between land and sea reaches its final, explosive conclusion in what history would remember as the Great Primal War. The continents had stretched their rocky fingers across the primordial ocean, and the seas had deepened into vast, dark basins. Groudon and Kyogre had sculpted the world in silence for eons, each expansion of land answered by a rise of sea. But that silence could not last, for the natural energy that powered their existence, lifeblood of the planet itself, was finite, and two titans cannot draw from the same well forever, without one eventually draining the other dry. The first tremors of conflict began not as a clash of bodies, but as a pull, a deep, invisible tug on the very currents of the earth and the tides of the ocean. Groudon, sleeping beneath a mountain range it had built, felt its source of warmth and creation being drawn away, siphoned into the depths. Kyogre, swimming in the cold abyss, sensed its own essence thinning, rising upward into the crust. They were not enemies by nature. They were builders, shapers. But the world was still young, and their purposes had become locked in a zero-sum contest. The land could not grow without stealing from the sea, and the sea could not swell without eroding the land. And so the first and only war of the primordial age began. It was not a war fought with armies or strategies. It was a war of raw elemental force. Groudon erupted from its mountain tomb, its body glowing with the heat of the planet's core. The sky turned red with ash, and the ground cracked open like dried clay. Magma rivers flowed down every slope, and the air thickened with sulfur. At the same time, Kyogre rose from the deepest trench, and the oceans obeyed its call. Hurricane winds spun the clouds into a spiral that covered the entire globe. The rain fell not in drops but in solid sheets, and lightning split the sky in endless chains. The sea churned into mountains of water that crashed against the newly formed continents, and then they found each other. Their first meeting was not a negotiation. It was a collision of two worlds. Groudon's fists, hardened by pressure and time, slammed into Kyogre's body, sending shockwaves through the ocean floor. Kyogre responded with a blast of water so pressurized it carved canyons into the bedrock. The battle raged across the entire planet, from the equator to the poles, from the highest volcanic peak to the deepest trench. There was no shelter. Every creature that had begun to stir in the warm seas or the cooling land was crushed, boiled, or drowned. The primordial world was being unmade. It is here that the Pokémon, known as primal reversion, first occurred. This was not a mere transformation. It was a regression, a pulling back of the veil between the present and the raw, uncontrolled origin of their power. Groudon's body began to pulse with a deep red glow. The lines along its back flared like molten iron fresh from the forge. It became Primal Groudon, and its very presence desiccated the atmosphere, sucking the moisture from the air so that rain evaporated before it could fall. The land expanded so violently that new continents rose in a single day. Kyogre answered in kind. Its skin grew darker, the patterns along its body glowing with an eerie blue light. It became Primal Kyogre, and its aura unleashed a deluge that flooded every valley, every basin, every lowland on the planet. The two forces reached the peak of their destructive potential, and the world began to tear apart. The very fabric of the planet, the balance between land and sea, was breaking at the seams. The battle was not about territory, it was about survival. Each Titan believed that the other's element would extinguish its own. Groudon saw the endless water as a cage, a return to the formless void from which Arceus had first emerged. Kyogre saw the encroaching land as a prison, a hardening of the fluid world into rigid, lifeless stone. They could not coexist, and so they fought until the planet itself screamed. The land cracked into drifting continents. The sea boiled and froze in the same hour. The sky was a permanent bruise of red and black and white. Rain that fell as lava met waves that rose as steam. There was no day or night, only the light of their fury. And at the centre of it all, the two primal beings clashed again and again, each blow sending ripples through the crust and the mantle. The world was a wound that refused to heal, but even in the midst of chaos, there was a third force, a silent observer, high above the clouds, watching from the edge of the atmosphere. It had no stake in the land or the sea. It lived in the thin, cold air where no ground could rise and no wave could reach. And as the war reached its breaking point, as the planet began to shatter under the strain of that primal conflict, this being made its move. The rains began to slow. The land stopped trembling, and the two titans, exhausted and furious, slowly turned their gaze upward, because something was descending from the sky. Something that had never before intervened in the shaping of the earth. And that is where the next chapter of the story begins. The ground shook and the seas boiled. The primal conflict between Groudon and Kyogre had spiraled out of control, their clash tearing at the very fabric of the newborn world. Continent met ocean in a brutal, endless war of expansion and deluge, and the planet groaned under the strain of two forces that refused to yield. In those desperate days, the land promised only more fire, and the sea offered only deeper darkness. There was nowhere to stand that was not caught between the two, but high above the chaos, beyond the clouds that choked the sky with ash and steam, there lay an untouched realm, the ozone layer, a fragile shield of gas and light that ringed the entire world, remained silent and watchful, and dwelling within that thin, cold vastness was a being who had never before descended to the surface. Its name was Rayquaza, and it had been born from the very atmosphere itself, a creature of the upper air, attuned to the quiet pulse of the sky. For eons it had drifted in the high currents, content to observe the slow dance of weather and wind. But the royal of Groudon and Kyogre was not merely a surface disturbance. Their battle was sending tremors through the planet's energy. Volcanic eruptions, tidal waves, seismic rifts, and those tremors reached even the highest altitudes. The sky could feel the suffering below, and so for the first time, Rayquaza began its descent. It fell slowly at first, a dark serpentine shape descending through the thickening atmosphere. The air screamed as it passed, thunder rolling in its wake. As it dropped into the lower skies, the clouds parted, torn apart by the sheer pressure of its presence. Groudon and Kyogre did not notice at first. They were locked in their fury, each drawing upon the deepest wells of primal energy to overpower the other. But Rayquaza did not attack them directly. Instead, it opened its jaws and released a storm of its own making, a maelstrom of swirling winds and brilliant light that enveloped the battlefield. This was the Delta Stream, the breath of the sky itself, a current so powerful that it stripped the excess heat from the land and calmed the raging waters. It did not destroy Groudon or Kyogre. It simply made their conflict impossible. The energy they had been drawing from the planet was siphoned away, redirected into the vortex of air. The two titans, exhausted and confused, could no longer fuel their rage. For the first time since the world had taken form, silence fell. The land began to cool, the sea began to still, and Rayquaza hung there, suspended between earth and space, a living bridge between the two warring elements. It had not come to rule, it had come to mediate. And in that moment, the sky was established not as a passive void, but as the third great pillar of the world's ecosystem, the force that held the balance between land and sea. Without the sky, the air itself would have become an extension of either fire or flood. With Rayquaza's presence, the atmosphere became a regulator, a thermostat, a shield. The Delta Stream did not merely stop the battle, it stabilized the climate for ages to come, ensuring that no single force could ever again claim dominance so absolutely. But peace is fragile, and the world was still raw. The land had been carved and reshaped by Groudon's rage, the ocean basins deepened by Kyogre's fury. The continents were not yet settled. They needed a different kind of touch. That did not involve battle, but immense, deliberate force. As Rayquaza rose back toward the ozone, its task complete, something else stirred in the deep places of the earth, a being that had been sleeping beneath the crust, waiting for the chaos to subside so it could begin its true work. That being would not fight. It would not roar. It would simply pull and push, inch by inch, shaping the land into the forms that would one day hold life, mountains and civilizations. And soon, very soon, the world would feel the slow, heavy footsteps of the architect of continents. With Rayquaza's calming influence, the great conflict between Groudon and Kyogre subsided. The sky remained a silent referee, and for the first time, the world began to cool into a stable state. But the land was still raw, jagged and scattered. The continents we now know were not yet formed. They existed as broken puzzle pieces. Drifting on a restless planet, something had to bring them together to shape the Earth into a place where life could thrive. That something was Regigigas, not a god of creation in the same sense as Arceus, but an architect of continents, a being of immense, almost unimaginable physical strength. In the aftermath of the Primal War, Regigigas was tasked with a monumental chore: to tow the landmasses into place. Think of the force required to drag entire continents across the ocean floor. Think of the slow, deliberate movements, the grinding of rock against rock, the reshaping of the world's very foundation. Regigigas did not create land from nothing. It rearranged what already existed, pulling continents together like a sculptor pressing clay. This was not a gentle process. Mountains were born from the collision of these drifting giants. Trenches were carved as the landmass settled. The earth groaned and shifted, and Regigigas walked the newborn terrain, pulling, pushing, moulding. But such a being could not be left to wander forever. Regigigas was too powerful, too vital to the world's structure, to risk being disturbed or corrupted, so it created guardians. From the raw materials of the planet, Regigigas shaped 3 lesser titans: Regirock, carved from the very stone of the mountains; Regis, formed from the ancient glaciers that still clung to the poles; and Registeel, forged from the molten metal deep within the earth. These 3 were bound to watch over the world's natural order, to protect the balance that Regigigas had established. They were placed in hidden chambers, sealed in temples, waiting for a call that might never come. But their purpose was clear. They were the sentinels of the continents, the keepers of the architect's legacy. And then Regigigas itself was hidden. Why? The legends are silent on the exact reason, but the mystery lingers in the cold halls of Snow Point Temple. Perhaps Regigigas had fulfilled its purpose and needed to sleep until the world required its strength again. Perhaps it was sealed to prevent another conflict, to keep its power out of reach of any who might misuse it. Or perhaps the architects of the world knew that the continents would need to remain still for a long time, and Regigigas's restless energy would only disrupt the fragile peace. Whatever the reason, the massive titan was entombed in the frozen north, in a temple of ice and stone, surrounded by the very elements it had once commanded. There it rests, waiting, and the 3 guardians remain scattered, each in their own crypt, ready to awaken only when the continents call out for their master once more. But before we can understand the full scope of this world's creation, we must turn to a different kind of origin, not the shaping of land or sky, but the very beginning of life itself. The next chapter explores a hypothesis that connects every living creature to a single ancient source. It is called the Mew Hypothesis, and it may rewrite everything we think we know about the history of Pokémon. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The great continental architect, Regigigas, had finished its work. The tectonic plates were anchored, the land masses towed into their approximate positions, and the lesser titans, rock, ice and steel, were left as silent sentinels over a world still cooling, still empty, still waiting. But the Earth itself was only the stage. The true drama of a living world requires actors, and those actors were not yet born. The geological time of Titans had passed its peak, and a new age was about to dawn, the age of life. And yet, the question of how life came to be on this planet of Pokémon is not nearly as straightforward as one might expect. The world had been shaped by cosmic forces, divine beings, and elemental titans. Arceus, the original creator, had emerged from an egg in the void and given form to time and space, to matter and antimatter, to the very fabric of existence. But the origin of the countless species that would eventually roam the land, fill the seas, and take to the skies was never explicitly defined by that first creation. The myth of Arceus is a story of cosmology, of the universe's scaffolding. The story of life itself is something else entirely. Enter the Mew Hypothesis. It is the biological counter-narrative to the divine creation of Arceus, where the primal deity brought forth the pillars of reality. Mew is said to be the most primordial of all Pokémon, the common ancestor from which every single species descended. This is not merely a mythological claim. It is a claim rooted in a profound and almost unsettling fact found in the Pokémon world's genetic research. According to old journals, ancient texts, and modern scientific analysis, Mew's genetic code contains the complete DNA sequences of every Pokémon that has ever existed. Every creature, from the smallest Caterpie to the mightiest Groudon, shares a fragment of that original blueprint. In Mew's cells, the entire family tree of Pokémon life exists in a single compressed strand. Think about what that means. If you were to isolate the genetic material of a Mew, you would find within it the instructions for building a Pikachu, a Charizard, a Lugia, a Rayquaza. You would find the code for the humble Magikarp and the majestic Ho-Oh, the crystalline Jirachi and the shadowy Darkrai. It is as if Mew carries within itself the genetic memory of every species that ever was and ever will be. That is a staggering notion for a world that also worships a being who created the universe from an egg. It creates a powerful tension, a divine origin versus a biological evolution. On one hand, the Arceus mythos suggests a top-down creation, a single all-powerful entity that shaped reality according to a grand design. On the other hand, the Mew hypothesis implies a bottom-up emergence, a single humble ancestor that gradually diversified over unimaginable stretches of time, adapting to every niche the world could offer. The two narratives are not necessarily contradictory, but they were never fully reconciled in the Pokémon lore. They sit side by side, two different ways of understanding how everything came to be. Perhaps Mew was the first life to emerge after the world was formed, a seed planted by the cosmic forces. Or perhaps Mew itself is the living breath of creation, a more subtle and ancient power than even the Titans. There is an almost poetic symmetry in this. Arceus, the Alpha, dwells in the highest plane of existence, beyond the reach of time and space. Mew, the progenitor, is elusive but still present in the world, a creature of this dimension, capable of invisibility and teleportation. Arceus created the stage, Mew populated it. But the Mew hypothesis also raises questions about the rise of intelligent life, about the lake spirits, Uxie, Mesprit and Azelf, who gave knowledge, emotion and willpower to the first living beings. Did those gifts come from Mew's lineage, or were they separate gifts from the cosmic order? The lore is deliberately ambiguous, a tapestry of overlapping stories that refuse to settle into a single answer. What is clear is that Mew's role as the ancestor of all Pokémon places it at the heart of a biological creation myth. Unlike the titanic battles of Groudon and Kyogre, Mew's story is quiet, almost secretive. It is said to be the ancestor of all Pokémon, and its DNA is the proof. The genetic code of Mew is a library, a living archive that contains the potential for every form of life that has ever existed. That is the core of the Mew hypothesis. The idea that diversity arises not from separate acts of creation, but from the branching of a single original stream. And yet, for all its scientific implications, the Mew Hypothesis remains a hypothesis. It is a belief held by some researchers, a legend whispered by those who have glimpsed the mythical pink creature in the wilds of the world. There is no canonical timeline that says Mew evolved into other species. Rather, the suggestion is that Mew is the genetic foundation, the seed from which the tree of Pokémon life grew. It is a story of connection, of a hidden unity beneath the surface of a world of fire, water, lightning and metal. As you drift deeper into the lore, you begin to sense that the world of Pokémon is built on layers of mystery. The geological age gave way to the biological age, and in that transition, the first living beings emerged. But where exactly did they arise? In a place untouched by titans, a sanctuary hidden from the battles of old. That place is known as the Jungle of Beginnings, and it holds secrets that even the most ancient myths have forgotten. The previous chapter explored the idea that Mew holds the genetic blueprint for every Pokémon species, a concept that shifts the lens from cosmic creation to biological ancestry. But if Mew is the ancestor, then where did it come from? And more importantly, where was it first found? The answer lies not in the heavens or the depths of the earth, but in a place that feels like a memory of the world before time had a name. The Jungle of Beginnings. Faraway Island is not a place you can find on any ordinary map. It drifts in the southern seas of the Hoenn region, shrouded in perpetual mist and surrounded by currents that seem to guard its secrets. For decades, sailors whispered about an island that appeared only when the moon was at its darkest, a patch of emerald green floating in a sea of impossible silence. It was here, according to the earliest recorded sightings, that Mew was first observed in the wild, not in a laboratory, not in a myth, but as a living creature, darting between the ferns and playing in the waterfalls of a jungle that seemed untouched by the passage of epochs. When the research teams first set foot on Faraway Island, they carried with them the most advanced genetic scanning equipment of their time. The goal was not merely to confirm Mew's existence, but to understand the origins of the Pokémon genome itself. They set up a temporary base camp near the island's central grove, where the canopy was so dense that sunlight filtered down in beams of pale gold. For weeks, they tracked the elusive pink figure, always catching glimpses, but never a clear sample. And then one evening, a young biologist named Dr. Yamada found a single shed feather caught on a low-hanging branch. That feather contained enough genetic material to change everything. What they discovered in the sequencing laboratory sent shockwaves through the scientific community. The genome of Mew was not just diverse, it was a living archive. Embedded within its DNA were sequences that matched every known Pokémon species, from the simplest Magikarp to the most complex legendaries. But more startling was the fact that these sequences were not randomly arranged. They followed a kind of molecular grammar, as if written by an ancient hand that knew the final story before the first line was set down. It was as though Mew's body carried the full library of life, compressed into a single, impossibly elegant code. That is when the theory first took shape. Mew is not just an ancestor, it is the clay from which all Pokémon life was moulded. Imagine a sculptor sitting before a mound of untouched earth. That earth holds within it every potential shape, every possible form, but it is still only clay. In this view, Mew represents that primordial substance, the raw genetic potential before any direction was given. The clay did not create itself. Something else, perhaps the universe's own creative force, began to shape it, pulling out islands of land, oceans of water, and the distinct species that would fill them. Mew remains as the sample of that original material, untouched and complete. This idea echoes ancient myths from many cultures, where a single being or substance gives rise to all diversity through a process of division or emanation. In the Pokémon world, it explains why Mew appears in places like Faraway Island, not as a ruler or a guardian, but as a living relic of the time before separation. The island itself seems to preserve that primordial state. The trees grow in patterns that match the spiral of the DNA helix. The waterfalls fall in rhythms that mirror cellular replication. Every step on that jungle floor feels like walking inside the genome of the world. The scientific expeditions did not stop with one feather. Over the next several years, more samples were collected. Scales, fur, even a single tear that crystallized into a perfect sphere of amber. Each sample confirmed the same astonishing truth. Mew's DNA is not merely ancestral. It is a map of potential that has never been fully realized. Certain sequences appear to be dormant, like seeds, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. This has led some researchers to speculate that Mew might still be evolving, that its genome is a living document that continues to write new chapters even now. But if Mew is the clay, then what is the potter? That question leads us away from the jungle and into a different part of the world, where the sky is not a ceiling, but a doorway. The Alola region has its own stories of creation, stories that involve light and shadow, and a being that emerges from a tiny star. That is the tale we will step into next, in the chapter titled The Alolan Cosmos, where the boundaries of what it means to create are stretched into a new and shimmering form. For now, let the vision of that jungle persist. The sound of water, the weight of the ancient air, and the quiet presence of the little pink creature that holds the memory of all life in its blood. Faraway Island, with its dense jungle canopy and pristine shores, has long been the focal point of those searching for the very first thread of life in the Pokémon world. The discovery of Mew there, a being carrying the genetic blueprint of every species, suggested a biological origin story, one rooted in the earth and sea rather than the stars. But as scientists pored over Mew's DNA, they began to realize something curious. The evolutionary tree they had constructed, with Mew at its root, did not explain every legend. Some tales spoke of light that came from beyond the sky, of beings that did not evolve but simply arrived. And those tales belonged to a place far from the quiet waters of Faraway Island, a tropical archipelago called Alola. Alola's mythology does not begin with a primordial egg or a clash of titans. It begins with a rupture in the fabric of the sky. Long before the first humans set foot on those sun-drenched islands, the cosmos tore open. Through these tears, these ultra wormholes, two radiant figures emerged. They were not born from the earth, nor did they evolve from anything before them. They stepped out of the void, as if they had always existed somewhere else and had chosen this world as their destination. Their names in the ancient tongue of Alola are Solgaleo and Lunala. Solgaleo, the beast that devours the sun. Its mane burns with the light of 1,000 stars, and it is said to possess the power to consume light itself. When it appeared through the ultra wormhole, it did not simply land on Alola's shores. It a celestial body in the island sky. Lunala, the crescent-winged phantom, commands the moon and its tides. Its wings shimmer like the night sky, and it has the ability to pull light from the shadows. Together, these two are the emissaries of an ancient cosmology that Alola's people came to call the Light Trio. But the Light Trio is not a trio of equals. In Alolan myth, the third member is the most mysterious of all. Its name is Necrozma, and it is often described as a fallen star that once brought light to the world, but lost its brilliance. The elders on Alola speak of a time when the entire region was bathed in a gentle, steady radiance, not from the sun or the moon, but from a source that seemed to live somewhere above the clouds. This was the light of Necrozma, a being of pure energy and prismatic power. It is said that Necrozma descended from a great light in the cosmos, the source of all illumination, and for a time it shared that light with Alola. But something happened. Perhaps it grew weary, or perhaps the world was not ready for such a gift. Necrozma's light began to dim, and as it faded, the ultra wormholes that had opened to welcome Solgaleo and Lunala began to close. The people of Alola watched as the sky mended itself, but they did not forget the visitors. They built legends around the three. Solgaleo and Lunala became the guardians of the day and night, endlessly chasing one another across the sky. Necrozma, on the other hand, was remembered as a tragic figure, a being of light that had given everything and now slept in darkness. Some say it retreated to a hidden dimension, its body becoming a black crystal that absorbed light rather than emitted it. Others claim it fell into the sea, waiting for a time when the world would need its radiance again. What makes the Alolan creation myth so different from the others we have explored is its emphasis on arrival. Arceus emerges from an egg in a void. The universe is born around it. Groudon and Kyogre rise from the earth and ocean to shape the world. Mew carries the genetic heritage of all life, suggesting a slow unfolding of species. But the Light Trio does not create. They come from elsewhere, through a door that should not exist. They are outsiders who become central to the identity of an entire region. In a sense, Alola's myth is about the unexpected, the alien, and the idea that light, whether cosmic or personal, can arrive from the most unlikely places. And yet, there is a deeper layer. The ultra wormholes are not just tears in the sky. They are pathways to other dimensions, to worlds that exist alongside ours, but vibrate at different frequencies. Alola's legends hint that Solgaleo and Lunala did not just travel through space, but through realities. They are beings that can move between dimensions, and their presence in Alola was a choice, not a coincidence. The natives developed a reverence for light in all its forms. The harsh sunlight, the soft moonlight, and the prismatic light that came from the stars. They built shrines and conducted rituals to honor the three, and they spoke of a prophecy. One day, when the darkness of the world grows too heavy, the fallen star will rise again, and the cosmic balance will be restored. The connection between Necrozma and the Ultra Beasts, those strange, otherworldly Pokémon that occasionally slip through the wormholes, is a subject of intense debate among scholars. Some believe Necrozma is the progenitor of all Ultra Beasts, a kind of primal light that fractured into many forms. Others see it as a separate entity, a fallen star that is merely the most powerful of them all. What is clear is that the Light Trio's influence on Alola's culture is profound. The island's flag, the designs of their clothing, even the architecture of their temples, all echo the patterns of light and shadow that Solgaleo, Lunala, and Necrozma represent. As you lie here, listening to the soft rhythm of these ancient stories, you might wonder how a being that lost its light could still be considered a creator. In Alola, creation is not always about bringing something new into existence. Sometimes it is about preserving what already is. Necrozma may have fallen from the sky, but it left behind a memory of radiance that shaped the island's entire worldview. The people of Alola do not look to the sun and moon for life. They look to the light that came from beyond, and they wait for it to return. The Kalosian cycle of life is yet another chapter in this vast mosaic, one where the boundaries between life and death, beginning and end, are blurred by a legendary weapon and a dormant power. But before we travel to that ancient kingdom, rest now, knowing that even in the dark, the light of a fallen star still flickers somewhere beyond the clouds. From the ultra wormholes of Alola, where creatures from other dimensions poured light into a new world, we now turn to a region whose creation myth is not about beginnings, but about the endless rhythm that follows. Kalos, a land of ancient forests, crystalline towers, and a philosophy that life is not born once and left to grow untended. It is perpetually balanced, perpetually remade. Here the legends do not speak of an egg in a void, or of titans shaping continents, or of a primordial ancestor whose DNA touches every living thing. Instead, the myths of Kalos are quiet, patient. They ask not where life came from, but what keeps it moving forward. The answer lies in two beings, and a third that watches them both. Deep within the forests of Kalos, where the oldest trees have roots that intertwine like veins, a slumbering creature waits. Its name is Xerneas, the life Pokémon. When it awakens, legends assert eternal life, not through resurrection, but through a gift that makes the very idea of an ending feel foreign. Xerneas is associated with the life force that pulses through every leaf, every heartbeat, every newborn cry. Its antlers glow with the hues of 1,000 rainbows, and those who have glimpsed it speak of a warmth that lingers long after the vision fades. But eternal life cannot exist without its counterpart. For every gift of Xerneas, there is the inevitability of Yveltal, the destruction Pokémon. Where Xerneas brings endless continuation, Yveltal brings the certainty of an end. It is not malice that drives it. Yveltal does not destroy for joy. Its presence is a natural force, as necessary as winter, as certain as the final exhale. When Yveltal spreads its wings, it absorbs the life force of everything around it, and those who see it feel the weight of mortality pressing against their chest. This is the Kalosian cycle. Xerneas and the gift of eternal life versus Yveltal and the inevitability of death. They are not enemies in a war. They are two sides of a single coin, spinning endlessly so that the world does not stagnate. Too much life and the ecosystem would choke on its own abundance. Too much death and silence would swallow everything. They exist in a tension that is neither good nor evil. It simply is. But a cycle needs a regulator, a referee that ensures neither force oversteps its bounds. And that is where Zygarde enters the story, the Order Pokémon. Its role is the most subtle and perhaps the most crucial. It is the ecosystem's ultimate cellular balancer. Zygarde does not dwell in a single form. It is composed of countless cells, each one a piece of a larger consciousness. These cells are scattered across Kalos, buried in the soil, drifting through the air, nestled in the roots of trees. When the balance between life and death begins to tip, when Xerneas or Yveltal grows too strong, Zygarde's cells converge. They assemble into a massive serpentine entity, sometimes taking a form like a dog, sometimes a towering dragon, depending on how many cells have gathered. This cellular structure gives Zygarde an intimate connection to every corner of the environment. It feels the trembling of a single leaf as a spider climbs it. It hears the whisper of a dying star reflected in a drop of dew. Zygarde does not judge. It restores equilibrium. If an invasive species threatens to consume a forest, Zygarde acts. If a plague of decay spreads too quickly, Zygarde intervenes. It is not a creator, not a destroyer. It is a custodian. What makes the Kalosian cycle unique among all the creation myths we have explored is its focus on maintenance rather than origin. Arceus shaped the universe. Dialga and Palkia gave it structure. Groudon and Kyogre formed the land and sea. Mew provided the genetic blueprint for every Pokémon that would ever evolve. But in Kalos, the legends ask a different question. After everything is made, what keeps it from falling apart? The answer is not a single act of creation, but a perpetual process of rebalancing. Xerneas pours life into the world, Yveltal harvests it, and Zygarde watches the scale. And when you walk through the forests of Kalos at twilight, when the shadows lengthen and the air smells of earth and pine, you can almost feel the presence of that cycle. The rustle of leaves is Xerneas breathing. The stillness before nightfall is Yveltal's pause, and the gentle vibration beneath your feet, that is Zygarde, counting cells, ensuring that tomorrow will come as it always has. But in every region, the myths ask a different fundamental question. In Unova, the question is not about the balance of life and death, but about the nature of truth itself. What is real? What is an ideal? And when two forces embody those concepts, what happens when they collide? That story, the Unova myth of truth and ideals, is the one we will walk into next, where the shadows of two dragons stretch across a land that was forged from a single conviction. And so, from the eternal dance of life-death in Kalos, we turn our gaze across the ocean to the distant region of Unova, a land shaped not by the balance of a single ecosystem, but by a conflict far older and far more philosophical, a war between two ideas embodied in the very flesh of dragons. Before there was a region called Unova, before the first human set foot on its soil, there existed a single being of immense and terrible power, a dragon of white and black, its scales shimmering with the light of a truth so absolute it could shatter mountains, and the shadow of an ideal so pure it could reshape the world. This was the original dragon, a creature that was not merely a Pokémon, but a living principle. It was the embodiment of two opposing forces held in perfect, precarious balance. The truth of the world as it is, and the ideal of the world as it could be. For ages, the dragon slumbered in the heart of the ancient Unovan continent, a sleeping god beneath a silent sky. But then came the twin heroes, two brothers united by blood who discovered the dragon and awakened it. They did not seek to capture it, but to understand it. They listened to its voice, which was not a sound, but a pulse of pure conviction. And in that moment, they each heard a different truth. One brother heard the song of truth, the immutable, unchangeable reality of the world, the laws of nature, the inevitability of fate. The other heard the symphony of ideals, the potential for a better world, the power of dreams, the courage to defy destiny. And so a rift grew between them, a rift that mirrored the very nature of the dragon they revered. As the brothers' argument deepened into a conflict that threatened to tear their fledgling kingdom apart, the dragon itself could no longer contain the paradox within its own being. The strain of holding truth and ideal together became unbearable, and in a cataclysm that split the sky and shattered the earth, the original dragon tore itself apart. From that single magnificent form, two dragons emerged. One was a creature of burning white flame, its body composed of pure radiant energy. This was Reshiram, the dragon of truth. Its eyes burned with the fire of knowledge, and its heart beat with the rhythm of the universe's immutable laws. It flew to the brother who believed in truth and pledged itself to his cause. The other dragon was a being of crackling black thunder, its body a storm of concentrated conviction. This was Zekrom, the dragon of ideals. Its tail thrummed with the electricity of 1,000 dreams, and its wings beat with the wind of change. It flew to the brother who believed in ideals and became his weapon. But the division was not clean. The act of separation left something behind, a third form, a hollow shell, a void where the original dragon's heart had once been. This was Kyurem, the boundary Pokémon. It was not a new dragon, but the empty husk of the original, cast aside when Reshiram and Zekrom burst forth. Kyurem was the absence of truth and ideal, a being of pure cold potential, frozen and incomplete. It drifted to the far north of Unova, burying itself in a cavern of eternal ice, a living fossil of a lost unity. And here, dear listener, is where the myth becomes utterly profound. The conflict between the twin heroes did not end with the splitting of the dragon. It continued, generation after generation. The kingdom of Unova rose and fell, and rose again. But the battle between truth and ideal never ceased, and with each new war, each new clash of philosophies, the forms of Reshiram and Zekrom began to change. They were no longer simply dragons of fire and lightning. They became mirrors. They reflected the convictions of those who called upon them. The physical appearances began to shift based on the purity and intensity of the human belief that fueled them. This is the central thesis of the Unovan creation myth, that the gods themselves are not fixed entities, but projections of the human soul. Truth and ideal are not objective realities. They are interpretations, shaped by culture, by history, by the choices of every individual. Reshiram became sleek and regal, its white flames burning with the wisdom of the scholar. Zekrom became muscular and imposing, its black lightning crackling with the passion of the revolutionary. They were no longer just forces of nature. They were reflections of human ideology. And Kyurem, the empty husk, remained as a reminder that when truth and ideal are torn apart, something vital is lost. Kyurem was the cost of division, the void that could never be filled. Some legends say that if a human could somehow merge Reshiram and Zekrom once more, Kyurem would be restored and the original dragon would return. But such a fusion would require a reconciliation that has eluded mankind since the dawn of civilization. So as you drift into that peaceful space between waking and dreaming, consider the power of your own beliefs. The Unovan myth teaches us that the world is shaped by the truths we hold and the ideals we chase. And just as those ancient dragons were forged by human conviction, so too are we ever so slightly remade by our own thoughts. The line between creator and creation grows thin. Now, as the cold of Kyurem's empty cavern fades, a new storm is brewing across the sea. In the region of Galar, darkness is gathering. a dark day unlike any other, and the legends speak of a hero who will rise to meet it. But the hero may not be what you expect. That story, my friend, is waiting for you in the next chapter. The Unova myth left us with a fractured dragon, a story about the impossibility of absolute truth or absolute ideals without the other. Curum, the empty vessel, drifts through the region's cold mountains as a reminder of what happens when a perfect whole is torn apart by human conviction. But across the ocean, in the Galar region, a different kind of fracture occurred, one that did not begin with a quarrel among people or a philosophical divide. It began with something that fell from the stars, a wound in the sky that bled a strange purple light, and that light changed everything about the land it touched. You have to understand that before the darkest day, Galar was not the region we know today. Its rolling hills and misty forests held no strange glowing particles, no places where Pokémon swelled to colossal size. The concept of Dynamax did not exist. There was no power spot network threading through the landscape like veins of glowing ore. That all changed when an object, vast and unknowable, descended from the void between worlds. It was not a meteor in the traditional sense. It was not a hunk of rock or ice. It was a creature, if you can call it that, a being made of concentrated energy, a parasitic entity born in the vacuum of outer space, and its name is Eternatus. Eternatus arrived with no purpose we can comprehend. It was not seeking a home. It was not fleeing a predator. It simply came, and its mere presence began to warp reality around it. The energy it radiated seeped into the earth, into the very foundations of Galar, creating power spots where the veil between dimensions grew thin. The particles of this energy, known as Galar particles, became the catalyst for Dynamax, the phenomenon that causes Pokémon to grow to immense size and gain devastating power. But this was not a gift. It was a contamination. The first moments of the darkest day were not a gradual onset. They were sudden, violent, and absolute. The sky turned purple. The ground shook. Pokémon everywhere began to change uncontrollably, swelling to monstrous proportions, their eyes glazing over with red light. The people of Galar had no warning. They had no legends to prepare them for this, because nothing like it had ever happened before. There was only chaos, only fear, only the crushing weight of a power that seemed to have no source and no end. And at the heart of this storm, the source was Eternatus, drawing energy from deep within the planet, feeding on the very life force of Galar to sustain its presence. It was not trying to destroy. It was trying to consume, to absorb, to make everything a part of its endless empty hunger. But Galar was not unguarded. There were two warriors who had watched from the shadows, ancient beings woven into the region's oldest myths. Though those myths had faded into bedtime stories by the time the darkest day arrived. Their names were Zacian and Zamazenta. They were not gods in the sense of Arceus or Dialga. They were something more primal, more directly tied to the protection of the land itself. Zamazenta, the shield-wielding guardian, was said to have a body that could repel any attack. Zacian, the sword-bearer, had a blade that could cut through any defense. They were equals, partners, siblings in purpose, if not in blood. And they had existed long before the first human settlement rose in Galar. When Eternatus descended, Zacian and Zamazenta moved to intercept it. But this was not a simple battle. Eternatus was not a physical creature in the way we understand physicality. Its body was a form of living energy, constantly shifting, constantly draining the world around it. To strike it was to feel your own strength leach away. To block its attacks was to feel your willpower drain into its maw. The two heroes fought with everything they had. But the darkest day was not just a physical event, it was a temporal one. The presence of Eternatus and the immense energy it concentrated began to distort the flow of time itself. Moments stretched into hours, hours compressed into seconds. The fabric of causality in the regions started to fray. You might wonder why time would unravel. The answer lies in the nature of the Galar particles and their connection to the Pokémon world's energy system. Eternatus, being from outer space, was not bound by the same rules that govern life on this planet. Its energy acted as a kind of cosmic interference, disrupting the natural cycles that keep time steady. Think of it like a stone dropped into a still pond, but the stone keeps growing and the ripples keep multiplying, and soon the entire pond is nothing but chaos. That was the state of Galar during the darkest day. The heroes were fighting not just a monster, but a collapse of reality. Zacian and Zamazenta realized they could not defeat Eternatus alone. They needed to seal it, to contain its power before the time distortion became permanent. And so, they combined their strengths in a final, desperate maneuver. Zacian struck with its sword, not to kill, but to shatter Eternatus's hold on the energy it had gathered. Zamazenta raised its shield, not to block, but to reflect that energy back into the sky, forcing it to disperse. The two warriors worked in perfect unison, a dance of sword and shield that pushed Eternatus back into a dormant state. They did not destroy it. They could not. Instead, they sealed it deep within the earth, beneath what would one day become the city of Hammerlock, binding it with their own fading strength. When the darkest day ended, the purple light receded. The Pokémon returned to their normal sizes. The people emerged from shelters to find the sky clear and the ground still, but the power spots remained, and the Galar particles lingered in the soil and air, a permanent scar from the encounter. The heroes themselves did not vanish entirely. Zacian and Zamazenta transformed, shedding their physical forms to become something closer to relics, waiting for the day they would be needed again. Their essences were said to reside within the rusted sword and rusted shield, items that would later be passed down through legend, though their true power was forgotten by all but a few. The intersection of this extraterrestrial arrival with the regional creation lore is a fascinating point. Galar's myth of the darkest day does not fit neatly into the cosmic narrative of Sinnoh, where Arceus shaped the universe from an egg. It does not align with the evolutionary chain traced back to Mew. It stands apart, a reminder that the Pokémon world was not formed in a single orderly sequence of creation. It was shaped by collisions, literal collisions with forces from beyond. Eternatus is a foreign entity, an invader from the stars, and yet it became part of Galar's identity, its energy woven into the region's culture and battles. This suggests a universe that is not closed, not finished, but still open to influence from unknown depths. The Galar region, in its modern era, has built its entire Pokémon League around the phenomena of Dynamax. Trainers gather at power spots to harness the residual energy, battling in massive stadiums where Pokémon swell to titanic sizes. But the origin of that energy is often forgotten, buried under the glitter of championship matches and the roar of crowds. The ruins of the early darkest day, the ancient scriptures in the slumbering Weald, all hint at the truth, but few seek it. They have seen the face of Eternatus in art. They have heard the story of the two heroes, but they do not realize that the very stadiums they stand in are built on the grave of a cosmic predator that once nearly unraveled time. And yet the threat is not entirely gone. Eternatus sleeps, but it dreams. Its energy still pulses beneath Hammerlock, waiting for a moment of weakness, for a crack in the seal. The sword and shield remain, dormant, and their true wielders, the heroes reborn in different forms, have appeared across the centuries, always ready to stand against the darkness. But what happens when the seal fails? What happens when a new darkest day dawns, with no Zacian or Zamazenta to meet it? That question lingers over Galar like a shadow, one that the region's trainers and champions would rather ignore. But there is another region, far to the south, in a land of sun-scorched canyons and ancient craters, where the past is not so easily ignored. In Paldea, the past is not buried. It is visible, tangible, a wound that has never healed. The Paradox of Paldea is not a story about a single creature or a single event. It is a puzzle that spans time itself, asking whether the past and future can truly be separated, or whether they are forever tangled in a loop that defies understanding. And at the center of that puzzle lies a potential answer to Eternatus's own origins. a clue that might explain why the darkest day came at all. That is where our journey will lead next, into a land where time is not a line, but a spiral. From the chaos of the darkest day, when Eternatus rained down stars and Dynamax energy warped the very fabric of Galar, we turn our gaze southward, across the sea, to a land where a different kind of catastrophe carved its own legend into the earth, Paldea, a region shaped by a single overwhelming wound, the Great Crater of Paldea, a chasm so vast and deep that it seems to swallow the sky itself. This is no ordinary crater. It is not the scar of a meteor or the caldera of a slumbering volcano. It is a doorway, a tear in the fabric of time, and within its sloping walls, the rules of reality begin to fray. The locals call it Area Zero, a forbidden zone, sealed off by the Paldean government, where the laws of nature appear to break down. Here, Pokémon walk the land that should not exist together, a primitive form of the mighty Salamence, with jagged wings and a feral roar, charges through the underbrush alongside a futuristic version of the swift Jigglypuff, its body glowing with a strange metallic sheen. These are the Paradox Pokémon, creatures plucked from ancient prehistory and distant, far future eras, all coexisting in the same moment, in the same place. They are anachronisms, travelers stranded in the present, and the Great Crater is their holding cell, a gravity well of temporal instability. But why here? What power at the heart of this abyss forces open the gates of time itself? The answer lies not in the stars, but in a creature that has slept beneath Paldea for eons, Paradox, a Pokémon of legend so obscure that even the oldest records struggle to describe it. Ancient Paldean manuscripts, carved into stone tablets, speak of a being whose shell shines like a prism, a perfect crystal that can store and redirect light, energy, and even the fundamental forces of existence. That shell, scholars now believe, is the source of the terrestrial phenomenon, that dazzling crystallization that transforms Pokémon into shimmering giants of gemstone and light. Every Terra crystal across Paldea, every shard that empowers trainers, is a fragment of Terrapagos's awakening energy, and deep within Area Zero, Terrapagos slumbers beneath a sea of crystals, its shell pulsing with a frequency that bends time. What happens when a creature of such immense crystallized power is stirred? The Great Crater is not just a habitat for Paradox Pokémon, it is a prison of Terrapagos's making. Its crystalline resonance creates a bubble of temporal flux, a zone where past and future leak into the present. The Paradox Pokémon are not merely lost in time. They are drawn here, pulled by the song of Terrapagos's crystal heart. And here lies the most unsettling suggestion of all. Some texts, hidden in the shadows of Paldean libraries, whisper that the past and future are not fixed. They are mutable, shaped by the collective dreams and fears of the world. The Paradox Pokémon might not be real arrivals from other eras. They might be physical manifestations of what humanity imagines the past was like, and what it fears the future will become. The scientific community in Paldea is divided. Some insist that the Paradox Pokémon are genuine time travelers, their bodies showing adaptations that match fossil records or speculative evolutionary branches. Others argue that they are constructs born from the concentrated energy of Terrapagos, which can somehow read the subconscious of those who enter the crater and forge creatures from their expectations. A primal Salamence emerges because the human mind expects a dragon ancestor to be more savage. A robotic Jigglypuff appears because we project a future where technology merges with biology. In this theory, imagination itself becomes a creative force, and Terrapagos is the canvas. The Great Crater becomes a mirror, and the Paradox Pokémon are reflections of our own collective psyche. If this is true, then the boundaries between myth and reality blur even further. The creation myths of other regions, the songs of Arceus, the shaping of land and sea by Grudon and Kyogre, may themselves be crystallized imaginations, made manifest by ancient Pokémon powerful enough to turn thought into matter. Terrapagos, the crystalline foundation of the terrestrial phenomenon, suggests that the universe of Pokémon is built on a substrate of light and perception. The crystals are not just minerals, they are frozen thoughts, captured moments of time, and in Area Zero, they have been leaking for millennia. The paradox of Paldea is that we cannot tell which came first, the crater, the crystals, or the dreams. The Pokémon that dwell there are both the evidence and the question, and as we stand at the edge of that chasm, peering into the gleaming depths, we are left to wonder, are we discovering history, or are we creating it? The answers may lie not in the field of battle, but in the quiet halls of a library on a distant island where ancient texts are stacked high, waiting for a reader brave enough to turn the page. The Library of Canalave holds secrets older than any crater, and its shelves whisper of a truth that has been waiting for us all along. From the Paradox of Paldea, where the very fabric of time seemed to fold in on itself within the great crater, we now travel to a far quieter corner of the Pokémon world, the snow-dusted shores of Sinnoh to the port town of Canalave. It is here, in a modest stone library perched above the icy waters, that the most profound and unsettling of all ancient texts are preserved. You might expect a creation myth to be told in grand cathedrals or atop mountain peaks, but the truth of Sinnoh's origins is written on brittle parchment, locked in a room that smells of salt and old wood. Tonight, we open the book that few have ever read cover to cover, the collected scriptures known as the Sinnoh folk tales, and within them, the story that is whispered as the Veilstone myth. The folk tales are not a single narrative. They are a patchwork of oral traditions, transcribed over centuries by monks and scholars who lived in the shadow of Mount Coronet. The earliest fragments speak of a time when the boundary between human and Pokémon was not a wall, but a door. A doorway that swung open freely, allowing beings to pass between forms without question. You see, the ancient peoples of Sinnoh did not view Pokémon as separate creatures to be caught or tamed. They believed that every human carried the essence of a Pokémon within them, and that every Pokémon was, in some sense, a human wearing a different skin. The text described festivals where humans and Pokémon danced together under the stars, not as master and servant, but as siblings. It was a world without hierarchy, where the sound of a Pokémon's cry was understood as language, and where the land itself responded to the emotions of those who walked upon it. But that world did not last, and the reason for its breaking is what we call the Veilstone myth. The name comes from a particular slab of dark, smooth rock discovered deep within the caverns beneath Veilstone City, a stone unlike any other, inscribed with symbols that predate any known writing system in the Pokémon world. When the first explorers brought it to the surface, they found that the stone seemed to hum with a low, constant vibration. Scholars who touched it reported vivid dreams of a vast plain, a great tree, and a shadow that stretched across the sky. The Veilstone itself, not a text in the way we think of a book. It is a record etched into the very memory of stone, and its translation has been the work of generations. What the myth reveals is this: before time began to flow in a straight line, before space was locked into 3 dimensions, the universe existed as a single, unified awareness. The primal being that would later be named Arceus emerged from an egg in the void, but that egg was not a physical object. It was a thought so dense and so pure that it crystallized into form. From that thought came the first division, the separation of light from shadow, of existence from non-existence. But the ancient storytellers of Sinnoh did not speak of Arceus as a distant creator. They spoke of it as a presence that could be felt in the heartbeat of every living creature. And they believed that the moment the egg broke, the unity of all life was shattered. Humans and Pokémon had once been one, but the very act of creation forced them apart. This is where the Sinnoh folk tales become especially poignant. One tale, recorded in the Library of Canalave and known as the Tale of the Bonds, describes a young girl who could understand the language of wild Pokémon. She lived in a time after the break, when the separation had already begun, but she remembered the old way. She would sit by the river and speak with the Buizel, and they would tell her stories about the great migration of the ancient dragons. But one day, a hunter came and captured her beautiful friend. The girl wept, and her tears fell onto the ground. Where they landed, a strange flower grew, a flower that, when touched, revealed the true name of the hunter. And upon hearing his true name, the hunter felt a strange shift in his heart. He released the Buizel, and from that day forward, he too could understand the language of Pokémon. The tale ends not with a moral, but with a question. Why did the flower grow only when the girl wept? The answer, the folk tales suggest, is that emotion is the bridge. Love, grief, joy. These are the threads that still connect us to the old world. But here we must pause and consider something that often goes unspoken in the retelling of these myths. The texts we have in the Canalave library are not original. They are copies of copies, translated from ancient dialects into modern Sinnoh, then into the common language of the Pokémon world, and finally into our own tongue. Each translation introduced errors, some accidental, some deliberate. The scholars of earlier centuries, steeped in their own cultural biases, often reinterpreted the myths to fit the understanding of the world. For example, the original Veilstone inscriptions refer to a being called the one that dwells in the shadow of the mountain. Early translators, influenced by their own religious traditions, assumed this must be a demon or a malevolent force. They rendered it as the banished one or the destroyer, but more recent linguistic analysis suggests the original phrase simply meant the one who holds the balance, a neutral force, neither good nor evil. This being was not banished. It chose to step aside so that creation could proceed. Similarly, the concept of time in the old texts is not linear. The word used in the Veilstone is closer to rhythm or breath. Dialga, as we know it today, is described in later writings as a dragon of time. But the original folk tales speak of a presence that breathed the world into motion. Palkia, meanwhile, is not a dragon of space in the modern sense. It is the weaver of separations, the force that allowed things to exist in different places. The lake spirits, Uxie, Mesprit and Azelf, were originally not separate entities at all. One particularly obscure passage in the Canalave archives describes them as the three glances of the first being. In other words, active self-reflection by Arceus produced knowledge, emotion and willpower as byproducts. They are not Pokémon in the way we think of them. They are the eyes through which the universe sees itself. And yet these nuances are often lost in the retellings. The popularized version of the Sinnoh creation myth presents a neat hierarchy. Arceus creates Dialga, Palkia and Giratina. Those three shape reality. The lake spirits are born later. Then Groudon, Kyogre, Rayquaza and Regigigas reshape the world. But the folk tales themselves are far messier. They speak of cycles, not lines. They describe a universe that is constantly being woven and unwove. The very idea of a beginning is a modern imposition. The Veilstone does not say, in the beginning. It says, when the breath shifted. Perhaps the most profound error in translation is the assumption that the old language had a word for Pokémon at all. The term used in the inscriptions is Irui, which scholars now believe referred to any living thing, including humans. The original texts do not distinguish between species. They simply say, the Irui gathered under the great tree. That tree, which appears in multiple folk tales, is often identified as the tree of life, or the world tree. But again, the original word is not tree, but axis, the central point around which everything turns. So when the myths speak of a time when humans and Pokémon were one, they are not describing a literal merging of bodies. They are describing a time when the concept of separation did not exist. There was no need to distinguish between a person and a Pokémon, because the reality of the world was holistic. It was only when the breath shifted, when Dialga began to mark time, when Palkia drew boundaries, that the unity fractured. Why does any of this matter? Because in the Library of Canalave, hidden among the shelves, there is a single book that has never been fully translated. It is called the Book of Origins. Its pages are made from a material that resembles the Veilstone itself, dark, smooth and cool to the touch. Only a few fragments have been read aloud, and those who have heard them describe a feeling of profound recognition, as if the words were not new but remembered. One fragment speaks of a future time when the breath will shift again, and the separation will end. It says that when the last human who cannot hear a Pokemon's heart dies, the door will reopen. But until then, we live in a world of echoes, and those echoes are what we have been tracing through every region, from Alola to Paldea. Each myth, the Light Trio, the cycle of Xerneas and Yveltal, the original dragon, the Darkest Day, is a different echo of that first breath. They are all trying to tell the same story. That creation is not a single event but an ongoing act, and that we, humans and Pokemon alike, are participants in it. As we close this chapter on the Library of Canalave, we leave the books behind and step into a different kind of archive. The real-world development history behind these myths. How did the designers at Game Freak piece together these overlapping legends? What real-world myths inspired the Sinnoh creation story? And how has the franchise's own internal timeline been shaped by the people who write it? That is the story of Chapter 19. The real-world genesis, where the line between myth and history blurs in a way that might surprise you. But that is for another night. For now, let the sound of turning pages and the distant crash of waves on Canalave's shore carry you into a sleep as deep as the memory of a world where every creature knew its true name. The stories we uncovered in the Canalave library painted a world where humans and Pokémon were once indistinguishable, where the boundary between trainer and creature dissolved into myth. But those ancient texts are not the only origin story. There is another genesis, one that begins not in a void of chaos or an egg of light, but in the quiet countryside of late 20th century Japan, and in the hands of a boy who spent his days chasing insects through the tall grass. Satoshi Tajiri was not born into a world of video games. He was born into a world of beetles and cicadas, of catching creatures in jars and naming them with care. Growing up in the rural town of Machida, Tokyo, his greatest passion was the art of insect collecting. He would spend hours in the fields, turning over rocks, peering into hollow logs, and carefully capturing specimens to study and admire. To him, each insect was a small world unto itself, a creature with its own habits, strengths, and hidden beauty. He loved the thrill of the hunt, the moment of discovery, the quiet triumph of adding a new species to his collection. That fascination never left him. It became the seed from which an entire universe would grow. When the forests of his childhood gave way to suburban development, Tajiri saw the fields where he once played disappear under concrete. He wanted to preserve that sense of exploration, that joy of discovery, in a form that could not be paved over. So he turned to video games. He began designing a world where players could step into the role of a young explorer, venturing into unknown territories to find creatures, catch them, and bring them home. The concept was simple: monsters in pockets, a way to carry the thrill of insect collecting into the digital age. That concept became Pocket Monsters, later known to the world as Pokémon. But a world of pocket-sized creatures needed a starting point. It needed a first being, a primordial ancestor from which all others would descend. That task fell to Ken Sugimori, the character designer and art director whose brush would define the visual identity of the entire franchise. Sugimori drew inspiration from the gentle, mysterious quality of early life itself. He wanted the first Pokémon to feel ancient, elusive, and almost impossible to verify. It had to be a creature that could exist at the very root of all biological lineages, a being that would later be whispered about in folklore as the progenitor of every species. That creature was Mew. Sugimori designed Mew as a small pink cat-like being with a long tail and an innocent expression, but its simplicity belies its cosmic role. In the earliest game lore, Mew was said to contain the DNA of every Pokémon that would ever exist. It was the genetic blueprint of the world, a living fossil that science could barely comprehend. Sugimori's philosophy was to imbue Mew with a sense of wonder, a feeling that this tiny creature held secrets beyond human understanding. He made it rare, almost mythical, a prize that only the most dedicated players could ever encounter. In a way, Mew became the first god of the Pokémon universe, not a creator of time and space, but a biological creator, the source from which all life branched. Yet the series did not stop at biology. As the games expanded from Kanto to Johto, Owen and beyond, so did the mythology. The monsters that started as simple, collectible creatures grew into embodiments of the fundamental forces of reality. Land, sea, sky, time, space, antimatter, each region introduced its own pantheon. The pocket monsters became architects of the universe. The evolution from monsters in pockets to creators of the universe is a testament to how deeply the franchise was willing to explore the questions of existence. Tajiri's childhood jars gave way to cosmic eggs. The insects he once caught became creatures that could reshape continents and bend the fabric of reality. But even as the lore expanded into the metaphysical, the core remained the same: the desire to discover, to capture, and to wonder. The real-world genesis of Pokémon is not just a story about a game designer or an artist. It is a story about how a simple childhood passion can grow into a mythology that spans generations. It is the realization that the first step toward creating a universe is often just a boy kneeling in the grass, watching a beetle crawl across his palm. And that brings us to the next chapter in the creation story. The tales of the Canalave library are not the only ancient texts. There is another document, one that was developed in secret, compiled by the designers themselves. A kind of scripture for the Pokémon world. It details the divine hierarchy, the relationships between legendary beings, and the precise order of cosmic events. This document is known as the Sinnoh Bible. Up next, we will open its pages and trace the lines that connect the first god to the last, from Mew to Arceus, from a boy's collection to the birth of everything. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. From the real-world genesis, where Satoshi Tajiri's childhood net and Ken Sugimori's pencil first sketched the outlines of a pocket-sized god, we now step fully into the realm where that god was given a name, a purpose, and a universe to command. It is one thing to conceive of a creator creature, a singular being from which all others spring. It is quite another to build an entire cosmology around it, complete with lesser deities, primordial forces, and a creation myth that feels both ancient and newly forged. When Game Freak began development on Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, they made a deliberate, almost radical choice. Instead of grounding the new legendary Pokémon in the biological ancestry model that Mew had so elegantly represented in Kanto, they decided to explore something far more abstract. They would move away from origins, rooted in evolution and inheritance, and instead venture into the territory of metaphysics, of time, space, and the very fabric of reality. This was not a small pivot. It was a redefinition of what legendary Pokémon could mean within the franchise. The team, led by director Junichi Masuda and scenario writer Hitomi Sato, wanted Diamond and Pearl to feel mythologically weighty. They knew that Sinnoh, a region inspired by the island of Hokkaido in northern Japan, was geographically and culturally distinct from the tropical Hoenn or the industrial Kanto. It was colder, more remote, and the locals, the pseudo-historical inhabitants of the region, seemed to hold a deeper reverence for the forces of nature. To capture that essence, Game Freak needed a pantheon, not just a monster. The influence of Shinto mythology is unmistakable in the design of the creation trio. In Shinto, the universe begins not with a single creator god, but with the primordial chaos from which two deities, Izanagi and Izanami, emerge to shape the world. In Sinnoh, Arceus hatches from an egg amidst a vortex of absolute nothing. From Arceus, three beings are born: Dialga, whose heartbeat is the rhythm of itself; Palkia, whose breath bends space; and Giratina, the one who was cast into a distorted dimension for its violent nature. These three echo the Japanese cosmic triad of heaven, earth, and the underworld. but they also carry echoes of something older. Greek mythology too left its fingerprints on these designs. Dialga and Palkia recall the Titans Kronos and Ananke, personifications of time and necessity, yet they are also reminiscent of the primordial forces that predate the Olympians. Giratina, meanwhile, evokes Tartarus, the deep abyss where the Titans were imprisoned. Game Freak's designers, including Ken Sugimori, often look to classical motifs when crafting legendary Pokémon, but with Sinnoh, they went a step further by weaving those motifs directly into the gameplay and the lore. The very geography of Sinnoh is tied to these myths. Mount Coronet is the pillar that holds the fabric of reality together, and the lakes of Acuity, Valor, and Verity are the homes of the Lake Guardians. Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, who govern knowledge, emotion, and willpower. The deliberate expansion of lore for Diamond and Pearl was not just about adding more text to Pokédex entries. It was about creating what fans would later call the Sinnoh Bible, a cohesive set of myths, legends, and historical texts that players could piece together by exploring the region, speaking to NPCs, and reading the books in the Canalave library. These texts, written in the voice of an ancient civilization, describe a time when Pokémon and humans were indistinguishable, when the world was shaped by the clash of primal forces, and when Arceus, the first being, brought order to chaos. This was a storytelling approach that Game Freak had never attempted before. In the earlier generations, legendary Pokémon were often just extremely rare and powerful monsters, with a backstory found in a single text or a single town. In Sinnoh, the lore was distributed across the entire region. You heard about the lake spirits from a fisherman, read about the creation trio from a historian, and uncovered the truth about Arceus, if you were lucky, through the Azure Flute, a mythical item that was never formally distributed in the original games. That deliberate withholding of the final piece of the myth only deepened the sense that the Sinnoh Bible contained mysteries too sacred for every player to, and yet even within that framework, the choice was clear. The biological origins of Mew, with its gentle ability to learn every move and its status as the ancestor of all Pokémon, felt like science. The metaphysical origins of Arceus and its children felt like religion. Game Freak intentionally blurred the line between the two, letting players decide whether the universe was created by a divine being or by the gradual evolution of a common ancestor. They left room for both stories to coexist, which is perhaps the most honest way to build a mythology, acknowledging that truth can be layered, that one story does not have to cancel out the other. As development progressed, the team faced the challenge of making these abstract concepts tangible in a video game. How do you make the player feel the passage of time? How do you make space feel vast? They solved it through mechanics. Dialga's Roar of Time, Palkia's Spatial Rend, and Giratina's Shadow Force. But they also solved it through atmosphere, Sinnoh's ancient ruins, the eerie silence of the Turnback Cave, the echoing chambers of Spear Pillar. All of these were designed to evoke a sense of standing at the dawn of creation. When Diamond and Pearl were released in 2006, players were captivated not just by the new species of Pokémon, but by the weight of the world they were exploring. The Sinnoh Bible became a subject of intense fan study, with theories about Arceus' hidden role, the true nature of the Distortion world, and the significance of the lake spirits. For the first time, Pokémon lore felt like something that could be analysed, debated, and reconstructed. It was no longer just a collection of myths. It was a living, breathing cosmology, and at the heart of it all lies the Azure Flute, an artifact that in the original games could have led players to the Hall of Origin where Arceus itself waited. That item, never legally given out, remains one of the most tantalizing loose threads in Pokémon history. It is the final verse of the Sinnoh Bible that was never read aloud. What secrets might it have revealed? What further layers of creation might it have peeled back? For those who have ventured into the deepest lore, the mystery of the Azure Flute is still a note waiting to be played. The previous chapter walked through how Game Freak deliberately shifted the franchise's origins from biological ancestry, Mew as the common ancestor, to something far more metaphysical. With Diamond and Pearl, they created a pantheon that stretched back before life itself, before matter as we know it. And at the center of that pantheon, they placed a being so remote, so deliberately obscured, that for over a decade it existed only as a ghost in the code. This is the story of the Azure Flute, the unreleased event, and the myth of Arceus that was locked away from every player until the world was ready to believe. In the original Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, players could obtain a key item called the Azure Flute. It was never distributed in any official capacity. Not through a Nintendo event, not through a mystery gift, not through any code or cartridge. The item existed in the game's data, and so did the location it was meant to unlock, the Hall of Origin, a place that, according to the internal geography, sat at the very peak of Mount Coronet, above even the Spear Pillar, where Dialga and Palkia were summoned. To reach it, you had to use the Azure Flute at the Spear Pillar, and a staircase of light would appear, leading you up into a chamber of pure white stillness. And there in the center, you would find Arceus, the creator, the alpha Pokémon. But no player ever saw that room in the original generation. The flute was never handed out. The event was coded, fully functional, and then deliberately withheld. Why? The official reason was that Game Freak wanted to maintain Arceus' status as a mythic figure. Not just another legendary you could catch with a bit of patience and a guide. They believed that if Arceus was too easy to obtain, it would lose the sense of divine remoteness that made it special. So they hid it. They left the flute in the data as a kind of phantom promise, a rumor that spread through forums and fan sites for years. And that rumor became one of the most persistent urban legends in Pokémon history. Players data mined the game. They found the Hall of Origin. They found the staircase. They found the battle with Arceus, complete with a unique transparent sprite and a battle theme that never played for anyone. They uploaded videos of themselves using action replay codes to warp directly to the room or to force the Azure Flute into their inventory, and the community was spellbound. Here was a Pokémon that was supposed to be almost impossible to see. Yet its entire encounter was sitting there, waiting. The question became, when would Nintendo finally release the event? The answer was never. Not for Diamond and Pearl, not for Platinum. The Azure Flute remained unused for the entire 4th generation. The decision to hold back Arceus was part of a larger strategy. Game Freak understood that the mystery itself had power. If Arceus could be caught by anyone with a Wi-Fi connection, the experience would be flattened into just another boss fight. But by leaving it as a myth, they allowed players to imagine it, to speculate, to build lore around the unreachable. In a way, Arceus became more real in absence than it ever could have been in presence. The Hall of Origin was a sacred space that no one was allowed to enter, and that exclusion made Arceus feel less like a Pokémon and more like a deity who had chosen not to reveal itself. The situation changed with Pokémon Legends. Arceus, the game that finally brought the creator into direct narrative focus. But even that game did not simply hand you the Azure Flute. It built an entire story around earning the trust of the mythical being. You had to complete the Pokédex of Hisui, catch every known species, and then prove your worth through a series of trials. Only then could you confront Arceus in a battle that was as much about understanding as it was about capturing. The transition from urban legend to official canon was not a simple distribution. It was a reimagining of the entire myth. The Azure Flute, the Hall of Origin, the Staircase of Light, all of it was recontextualized into a new story that honored the original mystery, while finally allowing players to experience what had been locked away for so long. What is fascinating is how that original unreleased event shaped the lore of the franchise. For over a decade, Arceus existed primarily as a rumor, a data-mined ghost, and in that liminal state, fans constructed their own interpretations, their own deeper mythologies. They debated whether Arceus was truly the first, or whether there was something before it. They theorized about the nature of the Hall of Origin, whether it existed in space, in a separate dimension, or at the very center of the Pokémon world, and all of that speculation became part of the tapestry that eventually led to Hisui. The story of the Azure Flute is a reminder that sometimes the most powerful myth is the one that is never fully shown, but every mystery eventually demands a resolution. And when that resolution finally came, it was not as a simple distribution event, but as a whole new perspective on the creation myth itself, the perspective of a region long forgotten, where humans and Pokémon lived side by side, and where the creator's true nature was revealed, not through a flute, but through a journey of discovery. And that journey, the one that finally gave Arceus its place in canon, is the subject of the next chapter, the Hisuian Perspective. It is there, in the ancient Sinnoh of the past, that the line between myth and reality becomes as thin as the air on Mount Coronet's highest peak. The Azure Flute remains one of the great unsolved riddles in Pokémon history. For years, players held that mystical item in their inventories, unsure how to summon its intended melody. The Hall of Origin, that ethereal chamber high above the Sinnoh region, was locked behind a gate that only the flute could open. And yet, despite all the code diving, the glitch hunting, the rumours whispered in fan forums, no official event ever granted access. Arceus, the supposed creator of all, remained deliberately hidden. That choice was not a mistake. Game Freak understood something profound. A god you cannot reach is far more powerful than a god you can catch. By keeping Arceus out of reach, they preserved the mystery, they preserved the faith. But faith alone cannot sustain a mythology for long. In the ancient land of Hisui, long before the modern Sinnoh region bore that name, the people lived in direct dialogue with the divine. They did not have the luxury of skepticism. They looked up at the sky and saw a massive shimmering rift tearing across the heavens, a wound in reality itself. And they knew, without a shadow of doubt, that something was terribly wrong with their world. To understand how the ancient Hisuians viewed what they called the Great Sinnoh, we must first strip away everything we know about modern Sinnoh. The canals of Jubilife, the glittering skyscrapers of Veilstone, the orderly routes and the Pokémon League. None of that existed. Hisui was a frontier, a land of snow-capped peaks, dense forests and unpredictable seas. The people who lived there did not have the internet or Professor Rowan's research. They had oral tradition, crude writings, and a deep reverent fear of the unknown. The Great Sinnoh was not a region to them. It was a force, a presence. In the oldest surviving texts, scratched onto bark and stone, the Hisuians described Sinnoh as the realm of the gods. It was the place where the heavens met the earth, where time and space themselves were born. But the name itself is revealing. Sinnoh is thought to derive from an ancient word meaning mysterious or sacred. To the early settlers, the entire peninsula was a holy site, a stage upon which the cosmic drama of creation had unfolded. And yet, not everyone agreed on what that drama meant. This is where the schism begins. The Diamond Clan and the Pearl Clan. These were not just rival factions. They were two entirely different interpretations of reality. Both revered the same fundamental forces, but they named them differently, understood them differently, and worshipped them through different rites. The Diamond Clan looked at the sky and saw time itself. For them, the flow of day and night, the changing seasons, the aging of their elders, and the growth of their crops, all of it pointed to a single all-encompassing entity, Dialga, the master of time. They called Sinnoh by that name, believing that the very fabric of existence was woven from temporal threads. The Pearl Clan, conversely, saw the world in terms of space, the vastness of the oceans, the distances between peaks, the boundaries between land and sky. For them, the creator was Palkia, the entity that shaped the dimensions of reality. They called Sinnoh by that name as well, but their Sinnoh was a realm of spatial majesty, not temporal flow. Both clans were right, in their own way, because both were worshipping fragments of a greater truth. But fragments by nature cannot see the whole. This religious division was not merely theological, it dictated daily life. The Diamond Clan built their settlements around the rhythms of the moon and sun. They planted and harvested according to celestial cycles. Their shamans interpreted omens from the movement of stars. The Pearl Clan, on the other hand, mapped their world physically. They revered boundaries and transitions. The edge of a forest, the bank of a river, the line between calm water and rapids. For them, the sacred was found in the spaces between things. And then, of course, there was the third force, the one neither clan openly acknowledged, the one that had been banished to the deepest pit of the world. Giratina, the Pokémon of antimatter, was not part of the public worship. Its existence was whispered, feared, and suppressed. But you cannot erase a god by ignoring it. Giratina's influence seeped through the very cracks in reality, especially through the rift that had torn open in the sky above Mount Coronet. That rift was the central crisis of Hisuian history. It was not a natural phenomenon. It was not a storm or an aurora. It was a wound, a gap through which unfettered chaos poured into the world. The Hisuians called it many things: the sky rift, the fracture, the devouring light. And for years, they tried everything to close it. They held ceremonies. They offered sacrifices. They sent their bravest warriors to climb the mountain and confront whatever lay on the other side. Nothing worked. Then came Volo. Volo was not a clan member. He was a merchant, a traveller, a trader in ancient artifacts and obscure knowledge. He appeared in the settlements of Hisui with wares that no one had seen before. Plates etched with symbols, fragments of a mysterious mythology that seemed older than both clans. At first, he was welcomed. He had answers. He knew things. He spoke of a being called Arceus, not Dialga, not Palkia, but something above them both, the true creator, the one who had hatched from an egg in the void and shaped the universe with 1,000 hands. But Volo's ambition was not about enlightenment. It was about control. He had discovered, through his study of the plates, that Arceus was not merely a distant creator. It was a being that could be summoned, perhaps even challenged. And the rift in the sky was not a coincidence. It was a doorway that, if properly exploited, could allow someone to ascend beyond the limits of time and space. Volo saw the chaos of the rift not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. The true nature of the rift became clear only when Volo revealed his plan. The fracture was not created by some random cosmic accident. It was a consequence of Arceus's own actions. A tear left behind when the original being attempted to leave or to hide, and Volo intended to use that tear as a bridge. He would gather the plates, each one imbued with a fragment of Arceus's power, and then climbed the highest peak of Mount Coronet. There, at the apex of the rift, he would force Arceus to appear, and then, with the combined strength of all the plates, he would seize the god's power for himself. The clans, of course, had no idea. They saw Volo as a helpful stranger. He traded with both Diamond and Pearl, never taking sides, always offering rare items for their collections. But behind that friendly facade, he was manipulating them. He knew that the clan's strained relationship would keep them from uniting against him, and he was right. It took a lone traveller from another time to stop him, a person who had been pulled through the rift, who had seen the truth beyond the veil. That person, the protagonist of the Hisuian story, became the bridge between the Diamond and Pearl interpretations. They learned that both clans were right, but incomplete. Time and space were not rivals. They were partners, intertwined by the will of a greater being. And Giratina, the Forgotten One, was not evil. It was a necessary balance, a shadow that gave form to the light. In the end, the rift was closed not by force, but by understanding. The Hisuians, guided by that outsider, finally saw the great Sinnoh as it truly was. A realm where all forces coexisted: time, space, antimatter, and above them, the silent presence of Arceus, watching from a distance beyond mortal reach. But the story does not end there. The rift may have been sealed, but the truth behind it, the truth behind the very structure of reality, opened a door that could never be fully closed. For if Arceus exists in one timeline, it must also exist in others. And if the multiverse theory holds, then every creation myth ever told might be true in some world, somewhere beyond the veil. That is a story for another night. A story that begins with a single question. What would happen if the threads of time and space were not fixed, but woven into an infinite tapestry? We will explore that question in Chapter 23, when we enter the realm of the multiverse theory. Until then, rest easy, knowing that even the greatest mysteries are held within the calm of a sleeping mind. The Diamond and Pearl clans of Hisui each held a different truth about the origin of their world. One worshipped the Lord of Time, the other the Lord of Space, and both believed their interpretation was absolute. But what if both sides were right? What if the truth of the universe is not a single thread, but a web of infinite strands, each one a different reality, where those ancient events played out in a slightly different way? That is the terrifying and beautiful implication of the multiverse theory, and it is woven into the very fabric of the Pokémon world in ways most players never fully realized. To understand this, we have to look at the moment the franchise itself split open the boundaries of reality. That happened in Generation 6 with the introduction of Mega Evolution. For the first time, we saw Pokémon surpassing the limits of their normal forms, channeling a power that seemed to come from another plane. But what was that power? The games hinted at a connection to a different timeline. In Pokémon X and Y, the ultimate weapon of the ancient Kalos War was powered by the life force of Pokémon, and its use triggered a catastrophic event that, as we later learn, may have torn open a rift in time and space. Then came Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the remakes that changed everything. In the original Ruby and Sapphire, the conflict between Groudon and Kyogre was resolved by Rayquaza, but nothing more was said about alternate dimensions. The Delta episode of the remakes, however, introduced a third legendary, Deoxys, and with it a meteor from space carrying a virus that could transform its host. But the true revelation came when Zinnia, the lawkeeper of the Draconid people, explained the truth. The world of the Hoenn remakes is actually a parallel universe, one where Mega Evolution exists and the ultimate weapon was used. The original world, without Mega Evolution, is a separate timeline, and that means the events of every game, whether it be Pokémon Red on the Game Boy or Pokémon Sun on the Nintendo 3DS. But they are not the same canon. They are different branches on the same tree of creation. This is where Hooper and its rings come into the story. Hooper, the mischief Pokémon, has the power to create rings that connect any 2 points in space. In the movie Hooper, The Clash of Ages, it used these rings to summon legendary Pokémon from across different eras and dimensions. But the rings are not just a plot device for a film, they are a metaphysical key. Consider the ancient texts of the Sinnoh region, where the creation trio of Dialga, Palkia and Giratina are said to have been born from the egg of Arceus. Now consider the Alolan legends, where Solgaleo and Lunala are said to have emerged from a cosmog to bring light to the world. How can both be true? Hooper's rings might be the answer. What if the rings are capable of connecting not just spaces, but entire realities? What if the creation myths of different regions are not competing stories, but accounts of different universes, each one originating from a different expression of Arceus? In one reality, Arceus created time and space. In another, it created light and darkness. In yet another, it created life directly through Mew. The rings could be the threads that link these realities together, allowing a being from one creation myth to appear in another, like Hooper summoning a Dialga from a world where its role is slightly different. This perspective transforms every player's journey into something profound. When you start a new game of Pokémon, you are not simply repeating the same story. You are entering a unique parallel universe. Your character, the rival, the order in which you catch Pokémon, every choice you make, it all creates a new branch of reality. Game Freak has confirmed this implicitly through the mechanics of online trading and battling. where trainers from different versions of the same region interact, as if they are crossing dimensional boundaries. The link cable that connects two Game Boys is a physical manifestation of Hooper's Ring, bridging two realities. And when you trade a Pokémon from your Fire Red to your Diamond, you are transferring a creature from one universe into another, where the laws of time and space may be just a little different. This multiverse theory answers a question that has long haunted fans. Why do the creation myths not agree with each other? Because they are all true, just in different timelines. The Hisuian people were not wrong to worship the Lord of Time or of Space. They were simply describing one version of reality. In another timeline, the Lord of Darkness and Light, or the Bringer of Knowledge, might be the central figure. The Delta episode made this explicit when Zinnia spoke of a Mega Evolution timeline and a non-Mega Evolution timeline, and she revealed that the Meteor Deoxys came from a separate dimension. The fabric of Pokémon reality is a patchwork of countless alternates, stitched together by the mysterious power of Hooper's Rings, the ultimate weapon, and the very nature of the Pokémon universe itself. And somewhere within that vast multiverse, there is a version of reality where the distorted world of Giratina was never sealed away, where the antimatter realm spills into the normal world. That story, the forbidden law of Giratina and its banishment, is a tale of cosmic betrayal and shadow, and it will reveal why the most unstable of the creation trio is perhaps the most important guardian of the multiverse. That is what we will explore in Chapter 24, The Forbidden Law of Giratina. The previous chapter took us across the multiverse, showing how Mega Evolution and the Delta episode opened a crack between timelines, and how Hooper's Rings stitched together realities that should never have touched. It's a dizzying thought that the universe we know is just one thread in an infinite weave, each world with its own Arceus, its own Dialga, its own Palkia. But there is one constant across nearly every version of the Sinnoh myth, one figure who is always cast out, always hidden, always misunderstood. That is Giratina, the renegade Pokémon, and its story is the most tragic of all. In the earliest accounts, when Arceus shaped the cosmos from the chaos of an egg, it created three beings to govern the fundamental pillars of existence: Dialga for time, Palkia for space, and Giratina for antimatter. But antimatter is not evil, it is simply the mirror of matter. In physics, when matter and antimatter meet, they annihilate in a flash of pure energy. So too, in the Pokémon world, Giratina's domain is a necessary opposite, a balancing force. Without it, the universe would be lopsided, unstable. Yet the myths tell us that Giratina was banished for its violent nature. Why? Because its very presence threatened the order that Dialga and Palkia were trying to maintain. It was not that Giratina was malicious. It was that its role was too dangerous for the fragile fabric of our reality. Arceus, the creator, had to make a choice. It could not destroy Giratina, for antimatter is as essential as matter. So instead, it created the Distortion world, a dimension where the laws of physics are twisted, where gravity pulls in every direction at once, where time flows in eddies and loops. It is a prison, yes, but also a sanctuary. In that realm, Giratina can exist without endangering the rest of creation. The Distortion world is necessary for the stability of the physical world because it contains the volatile energy of antimatter in a space that cannot be shattered by its power. Without that pocket dimension, our universe would be constantly at risk of unraveling, of collapsing into the very paradox that antimatter represents. And here is the tragedy. Giratina did not choose to be the enemy. It was made to be what it is. In its origin form, Giratina appears as a serpentine dragon, its body merging with a liquid, flowing aura of red and black, its 6 tentacle-like wings trailing behind like threads of a torn veil. This form is its true state, the form it takes within the Distortion world, where it can move freely through the dimensional folds. But when it is forced into the physical world, it compresses into its altered form, a bulky, centipede-like creature with armoured plates and a menacing, almost mechanical appearance. The visual symbolism is profound. The origin form is sleek, organic, almost graceful, while the altered form is rigid, defensive, creature that has been warped by its imprisonment. The altered form is Giratina's armor, the shell it has grown to survive in a world that rejected it. This dichotomy in the game lore, especially in Pokémon Platinum, when Cyrus, the leader of Team Galactic, tries to create a new universe without spirit and emotion, he seeks out Giratina not as a servant but as a tool. He believes the Distortion world can be the foundation for his perfect, empty reality, and Giratina responds with fury, but that fury is not mindless. It is the anger of a being that has been misunderstood, locked away, and now summoned to serve a madman's vision. In the climax, the player does not defeat Giratina. They calm it, they earn its respect. The renegade Pokémon is not a villain. It is a protector, one that guards the boundary between worlds, ensuring the multiverse does not tear itself apart. His tragedy is that it will always be seen as a threat, when in truth, it is the warden of a prison that holds its own power. Think about the implications for the broader creation myth. If Giratina represents its antimatter, then every act of creation generates an equal amount of destruction. The Distortion world is not a place of punishment. It is a necessary chamber where the universe's excess energy can be safely dissipated. Arceus did not banish Giratina out of cruelty, but out of necessity, and Giratina accepted that burden. It chose to dwell in the twisted shadows, watching over the edge of reality, so that Dialga and Palkia could continue their work without catastrophe. This is the forbidden lore, the truth hidden behind the legend of the renegade Pokémon. It is a story of sacrifice, not sin. And if we consider the multiverse introduced in the Delta episode, we must wonder, in every reality where time and space exist, is there always a Giratina? Is there always a Distortion world? And what happens if that boundary breaks? Hooper's rings could theoretically reach into those dark spaces, and that might explain why some timelines seem to diverge so violently. The Distortion world is not just a location, it is a pressure valve for the entire Pokémon multiverse. We will return to this theme of cosmic balance in the next chapter, when we examine the ancient wars and weapons that mortal civilizations built in the shadow of these myths. For now, let the image of Giratina's origin form linger, a silent sentinel gliding through an impossible geometry, forever keeping the universe safe from itself. The Distortion world exists as a necessary scar in reality, a plane where the laws of time and space have no meaning, a place Giratina was banished to for its violent nature. But violence is not inherently evil. It is a force like fire or water that can be shaped by those who wield it. And in the world of Pokémon, there is perhaps no more devastating example of violence shaped by human hands than the ancient War of Kalos. 3,000 years before the events of the modern games, a conflict erupted across the region that would come to be known as Kalos. It was a war between kingdoms, a war of human ambition and territorial greed, a war that dragged Pokémon into its machinery for the first time in recorded history. We know the outlines of this conflict from fragments of lore found in the games. A King Az ruled over a prosperous land. He was a man of science and ambition. But when the war took everything from him, when his beloved Pokémon, a Floette, was killed in the fighting, his grief transformed into something terrible. He could not accept death. He would not let the war take her. And so Azure built something that had never been built before, the ultimate weapon, a device of immense power, fueled by the life energy of countless Pokémon. He used it not to destroy his enemies, but to reverse the very process of death. He fired the weapon, and it worked. His Floette returned to life, but the cost was catastrophic. The weapon absorbed the energy of thousands of Pokémon, draining their life force to fuel its miracle. In that single act, the King of Kalos became a human who had weaponized the essence of life itself. But the weapon did not just resurrect one Floette. Its energy rippled across the world. It created a phenomenon we now call mega evolution, a form of temporary, battle-induced transformation that only occurs when a trainer and their Pokémon share an extraordinary bond, and when a special stone is present. The weapon's energy also gave rise to the mysterious stones that allow mega evolution, and it forever changed how humans and Pokémon related to one another. Before the ultimate weapon, legendary Pokémon had been seen as distant gods. Arceus created the universe. Dialga, Palkia, Giratina maintained its structure. Groudon, Kyogre, Rayquaza shaped the land and sea. Mew was the ancestor of all biological life. They were forces of nature, not tools. But after the War of Kalos, humanity had proven that it could manipulate cosmic energies. They had built a machine that could rival the power of legendary beings. And soon, they began to look at those legendary Pokémon not as creatures, but as potential instruments of destruction. The shift from creators to tools of destruction in the eyes of humanity is the most profound change in the Pokémon world's history. Consider the legends of Hoenn. Groudon and Kyogre, in ancient times, were natural forces that expanded land and sea. They fought, but that was their nature, like storms and earthquakes. Humans did not command them. They merely witnessed their conflict and prayed for it to end. Rayquaza, the Sky Guardian, would descend and calm them. That was the natural order. But after the Kalos War, humans began to seek ways to harness those forces. Team Magma and Team Aqua, in modern times, try to control Groudon and Kyogre. They see them as weapons to reshape the world according to human desire. The impact of the Kalos War and the ultimate weapon on the Pokémon world cannot be overstated. It introduced a precedent that human ingenuity, driven by grief or greed, could bend the fabric of reality, and it forced legendary Pokémon to change their roles in history. They could no longer remain passive forces. They had to respond to human interference. Some, like Xerneas and Yveltal, who are native to Kalos, are directly tied to the weapon. Xerneas is the embodiment of life, Yveltal the embodiment of destruction. The ultimate weapon used life energy to bring death and life together in a twisted equilibrium, and it drew the attention of these two legendaries, who now appear in the region as if they are guardians of the weapon's legacy. But the Kalos War also left scars. The king, Az, became immortal, cursed to wander the earth for 3,000 years, his Floette leaving him because it could not accept what he had done. They were reunited in the modern tale. But that story is one of forgiveness and atonement. The war itself is almost forgotten by the common people. The ruins of the ultimate weapon lie beneath Geosenge Town, hidden, but its energy still pulses in the mega stones scattered across the globe. Every time a trainer activates a mega evolution, they are tapping into the residual power of the Kalos War. Every time a legendary Pokémon is captured and used in battle, it is a continuation of that history. How human conflict forced legendary Pokémon to change their roles in history is a theme that echoes across every region. In Sinnoh, Team Galactic sought to use Dialga, Palkia, and even Giratina to recreate the universe. The lake spirits, Uxie, Mesprit, Azelf, were nearly used as tools to control the legendary dragons. In Unova, the legendary dragons Zekrom, Reshiram, and Kyurem represent truth, ideals, and balance, concepts that humans weaponized in an ancient war between brothers. That conflict split the original dragon into three. In Alola, the Tapas and the Guardianities are still worshipped, but modern humans try to exploit them through Z moves and totem challenges. In Galar, the darkest day was a cataclysm caused by humans fighting over a legendary hero's power. Everywhere the pattern repeats. The Pokémon that were once creators, shapers, or maintainers of the world become tools for human ambition. And this shift begins in earnest with the Kalos War. The ultimate weapon was not a natural phenomenon. It was a machine. It was a choice. And that choice echoed forward through history, making legendary Pokémon into prizes, weapons, and symbols of power rather than sacred forces. But there is another layer. The very existence of the ultimate weapon challenges the idea that legendaries are gods. If humans can replicate the power of life and death, what does that make Arceus? What does it mean for the creation myth? The Kalos War suggests that the line between creator and creature is thin. Humans too can create and destroy on a scale that rivals legendaries. And perhaps that is why, in the modern Pokémon world, The legendary creatures have become more involved. They appear to trainers, judge them, and sometimes grant power. They are no longer distant. They are reactive. They have learned from history. This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. In the next chapter, we will explore how all these threads, Sinnoh's creation, the biological ancestry of Mew, the elemental shaping of Groudon and Kyogre, the Distortion world, the Kalos War, and the various regional legends, are synthesized into a modern understanding. How Game Freak has woven these disparate myths into a single tapestry, and what that tapestry reveals about the true nature of the Pokémon universe. That chapter is called The Modern Synthesis, and it will attempt to reconcile the war between gods and the war between humans into one coherent truth. Until then, rest easy knowing that every mega evolution, every legendary encounter, every battle you fight, is part of a history that began with a grieving king and a weapon that bridged life and death. And the legendaries are watching. The ancient wars of Kalos changed everything. When the ultimate weapon fired, it did not just reshape the land or awaken dormant forces. It forced the legendary Pokémon themselves to step into new roles, their ancient purposes bent by human ambition. And as history settled, a strange truth emerged. The stories that tell about creation are never quite the same as the events themselves. This is the challenge we now face, the heart of what some call the modern synthesis. For years, fans and scholars have attempted to reconcile the seemingly conflicting accounts of how the Pokémon world began. On one side, we have the cosmic egg of Arceus, the Alpha who brought forth time and space and antimatter, who shaped the very fabric of reality from a void of nothingness. On the other, we have Mew, the primordial ancestor of all Pokémon species, a biological genesis that speaks of evolution and common descent, and between them, a tapestry of regional legends. Groudon and Kyogre raising land and sea, Rayquaza calming the sky, Regigiga dragging continents into place, the Ultra Beasts and Cosmog opening dimensional rifts. How can all of these coexist? The answer lies not in a single linear timeline, but in a concept known as layered creation. Think of it as a series of concentric circles, each layer resting upon the previous one. The outermost circle is the universe itself, born from Arceus in a flash of pure creative will. That is the metaphysical foundation, the rules of existence, the flow of time, the boundaries of space. Within that universe, a planet formed, and onto that planet came the forces of geology and climate. Groudon and Kyogre did not create the world from scratch. They shaped it, tamed it, heated its crust and filled its oceans. Regigigas pulled the continents into the arrangements we recognize today. And then, when the world was ready, life emerged. Mew is the progenitor of all Pokémon, the genetic wellspring from which countless species branched, from the humble Magikarp to the mighty Dragonite. This is the third layer, biology nested within geology, nested within cosmology. Each layer does not contradict the others, because they operate on different scales and times. The myth of Arceus speaks to the beginning of everything. The myth of Mew speaks to the beginning of life. The regional legends of Sinnoh, Hoenn, Alola, and beyond are not competing stories but fragmentary memories of these layered events, distorted by the cultures that witnessed them. The ancient people of Hisui, for example, worshipped the Pokémon they saw as creators, Dialga and Palkia, without ever knowing of Arceus. To them, time and space were the ultimate reality. Similarly, the early settlers of Hoenn witnessed the battle of Groudon and Kyogre, and assumed those were the original shapers of the world. And in every case, they were not wrong. They simply saw one layer of the onion, one slice of the cosmic onion, whose core remains hidden. Why then do these contradictions persist? Why does the lore offer no single clean answer? Because contradictions are essential to the mythic feel. Real-world mythologies are not tidy. They double back, they contradict each other, they invent new gods for new ages. No ancient culture ever sat down and wrote a definitive encyclopedia of their creation stories. They told tales around fires, and those tales changed with the teller. The Pokémon world is no different. The lore we find in game texts, library books, and old songs is not a unified history. It is a living mythology, evolving across generations of human and Pokémon interaction. And that is precisely what makes it feel authentic, alive, and worthy of our fascination. We must accept that some questions will never be answered. Was Mew created by Arceus, or did Mew arise independently? Did Arceus create the region-specific creator Pokémon, like the Tao Trio or the Light Trio? Or are those beings manifestations of deeper universal principles? The modern synthesis does not try to resolve every conflict. Instead, it embraces the layered nature of reality. Each layer has its own logic, its own beauty, its own truth, and the contradictions are not flaws, they are the scars of time. As we look toward what comes next, to the stories still being written in the Pokémon world, to the hidden corners of the mythos that may yet be revealed, we stand at the edge of something new. The future of the mythos holds the promise of even deeper revelations, of layers we cannot yet see. But that is a story for another night, one that will ask us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about creation, destruction, and the endless cycle of rebirth that defines this universe we love. We've spent so much time trying to piece together the layers of creation, the cosmic egg, the shaping of time and space, the rise of land and sea, the biological ancestry that connects every living Pokémon. But every framework we've built, every timeline we've stitched together from ancient texts and regional myths, now faces a fundamental challenge. The introduction of the Paradox Pokémon in the Paldea region doesn't just add new entries to the Pokédex. It rewrites the very meaning of creation itself. These are creatures from the past and future, plucked from eras that never existed in our continuous history. Walking Wake, a version of Suicune that predates written records, yet with traits that suggest it belongs to a different evolutionary branch entirely. Iron Valiant, mechanical future form of both Galar and Gardevoir, as if destiny can fold two separate destinies into one. The concept is not new. Time travel has always been part of Pokémon lore, through Celebi or Dialga's power, but the Paradox Pokémon are different. They aren't travelers. They are existences that have always been possible, but never actualized in our timeline. They imply that the universe does not have a single creation story. It has an infinite number of potential creation stories, each equally real, each equally valid. Think about what that means for our layered creation model. In the Sinnoh myth, Arceus emerged from the void and spoke the universe into being. First time, then space, then the distorted realm, then the late guardians to give form to spirit, then Mew to seed life. It is a linear process, a hierarchy of cause and effect, but the Paradox Pokémon shatter linearity. They are outcomes that arrived before their causes. Flutter Mane, a prehistoric Misdravus, should not exist if Misdravus evolved later. Yet there it is, fossilized in the pages of the Scarlet Book. Even the game's own professor, Sada or Churro, built a time machine to bring these beings here. But the more we study them, the more we realize the machine may not be traveling through our past or future. It is pulling from parallel timelines that have always coexisted alongside our own. This suggests that the original one, Arceus, might not be the singular beginning we assumed. If multiple timelines are real, then each timeline could have its own creation event, its own Arceus, or perhaps no Arceus at all in some. The very concept of a prime mover becomes relative. The Paradox Pokémon force us to ask, what if Arceus's egg hatched, but in another reality it never did? What if the void before creation is not empty, but a multiverse of uncountable voids, each one pregnant with a different origin? And if that is true, then the future of the mythos is not about finding the one true story. It is about exploring the canvas on which all stories are possible. New regions will continue to expand this canvas. Already we have seen Alola's Ultra Beasts emerge from alternate dimensions and Hisui's rift between past and present. The next generation of games, wherever they are set, could introduce a region so old that it predates even the Sinnoh creation myth. A civilization that worshipped a different cosmic entity, one that existed before the egg. Or it could introduce a region so far in the future that the Pokédex itself has evolved beyond biology, where creation means a different kind of genesis. The potential for new regions to redefine the beginning of the universe is not just a writer's tool, it is a narrative necessity. Because every time we think we have a complete picture, Game Freak shows us that the frame is bigger than we imagined. We are left then with the enduring mystery of the original one. Even after the events of Legends, Arceus, where we knelt before the Creator and caught it, we still do not know the whole truth. Is Arceus truly infinite, or is it limited by the reality it created? Why does it require the plates to change its form? Why did it create a world that could produce Paradox Pokémon, which by their nature contradict its own linear creation? Some theorists believe that Arceus itself may be a paradox, a being that created time, but that also exists outside of time, capable of observing all timelines at once. If so, then the Paradox Pokémon are not contradictions. They are threads in a tapestry that only Arceus can fully see, and we, the observers, are left to wonder if we will ever see the full picture. That is the future of the Mythos. Not an answer, but an unending question. Each new game, each new region, each new legendary will peel back another layer, only to reveal another layer beneath. We stand at the edge of what we know, looking out into a dark ocean where every island we discover only reminds us how much more there is to chart. And as we prepare to turn the page to the next chapter, a chapter that will contemplate the eternal cycle of destruction and rebirth across these many worlds, we carry with us the certainty that creation in the Pokémon universe is not a single event. It is a process that never stops unfolding, and so the Paradox Pokémon force us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about beginnings. If time is not a straight line but a loop, or a web, or a song that echoes forward and backward, then creation itself is not a single event but a process, a cycle without end. And maybe that is the deepest truth hidden within the Pokémon mythos. That origin stories are not locked in some distant past, but are still being written, still unfolding. Every time a new game begins, every time a child chooses their first partner, we have journeyed through the layers of this universe. From the void where Arceus first stirred inside its egg, to the shaping of time and space, to the birthing of land and sea, to the emergence of life from the primordial ancestor Mew. We have seen how the lake spirits gave us the very fabric of consciousness, emotion, knowledge, willpower, as if the cosmos needed more than just matter and energy. It needed meaning, and we have witnessed the conflicts and tragedies, the banishing of Giratina, the ancient wars of Kalos, the clash of Groudon and Kyogre. Each legend, each myth, a fragment of a larger truth. But here, at the end of our exploration, we must pause and reflect on what these stories truly represent. They are not merely explanations for how a fictional world came to be. They are mirrors. They reflect our own ancient questions about why we exist, about order and chaos, about the delicate balance between creation and destruction. And they do so through the simplest of vessels. A child wandering through tall grass, a trainer collecting badges, a player building a bond with a creature made of pixels and code. That connection between the player's journey and the cosmic order is the most beautiful thread in the entire tapestry. Think about it. In the games, you begin in a small town with nothing but a backpack and a dream. You are given a single Pokémon, a partner, and slowly, step by step, you move through the world, uncovering its secrets, meeting its legendary guardians, until eventually you stand before the Creator itself. You do not conquer Arceus in the way you conquer a gym leader. You approach it with respect, often after proving yourself worthy, and in that moment, the player becomes part of the myth. The cycle closes. The one who sought the truth now holds it. This is why these stories resonate across generations, because they are not static lore locked in ancient texts. They are invitations. Every time a new region is introduced, we are given a new creation story. Alolan Cosmos rising from the depths, Galar's darkest day, Paldea's mysterious Area Zero. and we are asked to integrate it to find its place in the larger mythos. The player becomes the historian, the archaeologist, the mythographer. We do not just observe the eternal cycle, we live it. So as we close this chapter, remember that the beauty of the Pokémon creation myths is not in their consistency, but in their mystery. They leave room for wonder. They allow for contradiction. They trust the listener to hold multiple truths at once. That Arceus is the beginning, and yet Mew is the ancestor, and yet each region has its own first being. In that ambiguity, there is a kind of peace, because it means the universe is still being created, still being discovered, and we are all part of that process. Perhaps that is the final lesson. The eternal cycle does not need a definitive end. It needs us to keep telling the story. And so, as you drift towards sleep, let the legends settle around you like stardust. Know that somewhere in the digital fabric, the egg still glows, the lake still ripples, and a new journey is always about to begin. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content. And if you know someone who would find this as fascinating as you did, share it with them. These are the kind of conversations that matter.